And we are live. This is Dark Journalists. What a fantastic crowd we have out there in the ideas room already. Of course, tonight I am joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And Olivia, I was dreaming when I wrote this. Forgive me if it goes astray. When I woke up this morning, could have sworn it was Judgment Day. This has been quite a week. And it seems like so many of the things that we've been working on here in the X series are now starting to surface in the broader texture of the world, which is always an unusual situation when you're working from a curve which gets ahead of its time, and then a lot of these things show up and you realize you're really deep in the omelet now. And that's where we are, and we find ourselves in this X series number 201. This is episode 201, and it is the UFO file deep event incoming, Three Eye Atlas with Avi Lobe and the Chris Mellon gang. Of course, this goes deep into the kind of deep state brinkmanship that's been going on, and it's been an interesting week that way because a lot of these announcements were coming out during the week. And, you'd see the Vice President, J.D. Vance, sitting there in his little interview chair saying, "Oh yeah, I'm going to spend the whole rest of the summer studying UFOs."
It's incredible.
And then we got Tulsi, of course, and she was like, "Oh yeah, aliens exist, but I can't tell you anything else." And then Robert Malone going into this whole routine about RFK Jr. and how RFK Jr. got a UFO briefing. And in that briefing, they told him, hey, Roswell was real, and we got night vision from it and all these other things. And the advanced technology bit, well, that was all real too. So something is going on in the background with that administration. We're going to get to the bottom of it tonight, and it is explosive. This is, basically a prelude into this fall, which I believe is going to be absolutely fascinating and riveting, and also maybe somewhat perilous. As we've seen. And tonight we're going to do something very interesting. We're going to draw a kind of tapestry between the UFO file over here and the deep state continuity of government over here. And this is the one thing which so many of the deep state researchers who are just generally so much deeper than the UFO field or the pop click podcast field, they've tried to very carefully draw a picture for us about what these emergency powers groups are all about. And I'm going to describe how they're so important to America here in 2025 and in the 21st century in general. This is the crucial political understanding, and it's completely missing from the dialogue, of course, in the corporate media, but in the independent media as well, which the independent media has seen its fair share of fluff, but I would say it's at an all-time fluffernutter point, fluffernutter degree 100. But I will say this, that, during this whole thing, there's a kind of I call it a psychic entanglement between myself and other people who do this work. And I got a text from Alex Jones early in the week, and he was tuning in as well. And we did a fantastic show this week, which was all about the same deep state activity going on, the people in the background bringing the UFO threat piece out, the counterintel agents forcing us into the UFO threat narrative, which is completely concocted, I should say, by the intelligence groups and the groups that are behind it. I'm going to unmask a couple of the key figures tonight. Of course, Avi Lobe here at Harvard. And as we've done before, we've unraveled the story of Chris Mellon and what he was really up to running Area 51 as this DOD billionaire. And with the help of his cousin, John Warner, we got to the bottom of a number of things. And so Warner's to be commended for helping in that effort. But what I will say is interesting. I'm going to use some of the quotes tonight from Mellon himself to show the depth of what they're doing with this and how they're trying to link it in with the whole AI explosion. Of course, tonight, before I go any further, I'm going to tell you that in the second half of tonight's program, we're going to be taking your questions. And, we're coming off of a couple of fantastic episodes. The last episode was with Gigi Young, and it was all about CERN, and it's a mind blower, and it's still heading for the fences there. But so many of you have given me tremendous feedback on that, and I'm, Gigi is just at her best, and she did a fantastic job. But in the second half of tonight's program, we'll take your questions about everything that's been going on, that episode, this episode, the Alex show, everything, and all the wild things going on in the world at large. Miss Olivia will put those together anytime you ask the question during the show. And at the end, we'll roll it out. We'll do a couple hours here with you tonight. Before I go any further, Miss Olivia, what do you got?
CB says, you've been amazing on InfoWars, buddy. And Nevermore says, here we go. Gonna be extra potent.
Look, we had so much fun. Alex was such a blast and really gracious. And I appreciate the time because he knew there was a lot to unpack. And we went in for it. We did a couple hours on his show. And his show is always very fast paced. But Alex is right there. And I'll tell you that this is a guy who's really blown up many of the deep state narratives over the years. Just phenomenal. And when he gets around the UFO file, watch out, because it's that explosive probing mind into this subject, which doesn't get a lot of probing minds. It doesn't get a lot of, very kind of penetrating and deep questions. What happens very often in the UFO field is some fluffy thing comes out and then it'll match up with some scientific thing in a haphazard way, and then there'll be a whistleblower associated, and the whole thing runs through the podcast circuit and then fizzles out about 9 months later. That's the pattern that's been going on. And part of the reason is that the field is not very well defined in the first place. And it lost a lot of its great voices, like Stanton Friedman and others, who had that background and who really grounded the subject. And it's quite fascinating because a major star of tonight's program is Philip Corso, the late Philip Corso, who gave us so much about the Roswell incident and how the development of that got into corporate America and more. But he also gave us key insights into programs like Star Wars. And since we're at Star Wars 2 with the Golden Dome and Trump's activity, and Hegseth was running around all week touting this as well, we're in the middle of that rollout. So we need to be right on top of it with what Corso said. And upon reflection, I'm finding that Corso put things on the record that are absolutely vital to the period that we're in understanding how they've gotten into this position of developing the exotic technology and how they've disconnected from the ordinary society, and how the clash over AI is the overlay that's on top. But believe it or not, that AI development is related to the UFO file, and I'm going to get into just how in this very, very special episode. Before I go any further, I also want to remind you, in case you have not, if you're new here, to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter. It's free, and it lets you know about all the exciting things that we have coming up for you. Shows, documentaries, incredible interviews like the one we just did with Gigi Young. Just phenomenal things coming your way. The documentary, of course, the Hot Zone series, The Craze in the Hot Zone, along with JFK and the UFO file. Those mini-series that we've been cranking out with an incredible production team, those documentaries are up there on this channel for free. But all that stuff is captivating, and it's right there in the newsletter. And you get it once a week. It'll let you know about the exciting things we have coming up for you, including events and things of all sorts of different opportunities for you to get more info quicker and go deeper with all of this information, and to really get to the notifications of the whole thing, which, we know in social media, they do a lot to block out the work that we do. We've found ways around it, but there's incredible censorship. And one of the things you'll notice about me is when things are like that, when there are blocks like that, I feel like talking about them builds them up even more. So I just spend my time trying to get around them. And this goes for the plagiarism too. And we had some run-ins with some people borrowing ideas in such a flagrant manner.
Borrowing. You're so polite.
These things need to be sorted out. The conversation about plagiarism in independent media needs to be worked out. And in this case, between me and this one author, after some wrangling and exposing the whole subject, but there's a lot of it. And, this is the nature of what I call peak metric. A lot of these podcasts, the thing that they need to do, and I've seen the marketing documents around this, because there's always these people in the industry that I'm connected to in one way or another. And they always show me this stuff, or, here's this trend that's going on with the podcast stuff. And of course, I don't care about any of it. But this one grabbed my attention because it was about how the podcasts that are out there are being instructed to double their output as a way of, you've got to capture the whole market. So double your output, put together a morning show, an afternoon show, an evening show, And so they're throwing more and more spaghetti at the wall to see what sticks. And they get stuck with a lot of counterintelligence people telling stories. And so you get a downgraded thing, and it seems like, oh, hey, it's a great headline, declassified UFO something or other, and then they roll out like Lou Elizondo or Avi Lobe. So it is a peak metric marketing thing, and you always have to be aware when you're dealing in the space that you're dealing with marketing forces and you're dealing with intel forces. Intel forces want to sell a narrative, marketing forces want to cash in. And right down the middle there, right, this little tiny corridor is dark journalism coming right down through the center, trying to get to the core, the potent core of all this. And for the guests that we have on, they get to the potent core of all this. So it's very important for that kind of, there's a real signature to work that's potent. And a lot of those people tend to work together, I've noticed. So when we have this larger field of podcasts, clickbait stuff, you have to be aware that we're in a different game as far as it goes than even in the last year and a half, where the intelligence services are on overdrive trying to get their narrative out and using this marketing thing to really build up their own platforms and to really silence independent voices. It's very important to get behind the work that you feel is potent and actually makes a difference, and to share that work, get behind it, subscribe to it, and make sure it comes your way, because that's really your army that's out there on the ground. And the more we create an ecosystem like that, then you're going to get something very good. I think ultimately the mainstream media, corporate media, state media, and the independent, what pretends to be independent media, these people with 7 producers and all that stuff, that's all paid media. So it's not really independent. The independent media, it's just corporate media pumping into independent media. So there's going to be a third corridor. It's going to come up here, and it's going to come in through things like dark journalism. But I'm absolutely convinced that it's crucial that we get something that reports without all that manipulation and the circus on top. And it was really fascinating. When I was on with Alex, one of the things that we were able to get to was this whole thing about Avi Lobe and, that whole 3-eye Atlas threat thing that he's prepared. And I was able to go into the history around how Avi Lobe is connected with the whole counterintelligence movement around the UFO threat narrative coming out of the intelligence agencies, and how he himself comes out of Talpiot, which is Israeli intelligence, which he was in for a decade.
Oh,
But
wow, a whole decade.
yeah, and his past is even more fascinating. This guy was a genius at a very, very young age, and brought over here to work on Star Wars at 20.
Wow.
20 years old in 1983,
Mhm.
and one of the original people around Star Wars. So he's been in the game, folks. He's a real deep player in his early 60s now, and it's just. And again, whenever I talk about these people, they're just people doing a job. That's what they're doing. They're going to work, and the people that they work for organize these things. So it's the narratives that I'm getting at and trying to dismantle, and the op to smash. The people, forget it. They'll reconfigure the people. 1 week you'll have Lou, the next week he'll be disgraced because he made some major gaffe in public, holding up phony pictures. 3 months later they'll launch him with a book, and a TV show, and then he'll go down, and they'll bring up this other guy. That's just the way they're going to run. But there's all kinds of things going on in that department, because the whole thing about Luna and the committees that were supposed to bring all this forward, the D-class committees, are completely struck out. They did no UFO hearings, 0, and they only have until the end of September. Now, they did some JFK hearings. Well, that's good, but they didn't get very much done. And the people who were involved didn't seem to know anything. So if anything, it just seemed like training for a new reality TV show. on the History Channel or something. So this is not, committee hearings. You really can bring things forward. You can get the right witnesses. You can have a whole potent conversation in relation to JFK and the UFO file. It's absolutely crucial and society paradigm changing. And they have the ability to do that. But instead, it's just kind of grandstanding questions. And the witnesses, I don't know where they're getting these witnesses or why they're going down this one track. They have this guy, Jefferson Morley, who's written some books about the JFK assassination. But again, the depth there, I mean, it's good educated work, but it's the depth about getting to the heart of the crime. This person didn't even believe until recently that the CIA were involved in any kind of conspiracy. So, you need a much more hard hitting approach if you're going to get anywhere. If that committee is going to be memorable, it is very time locked as well. So you have a very kind of specific time to work with, but they promised a lot. And what I see from the D-Class committee is interesting because apparently they had lined up all of these whistleblowers and things. And then they said, hey, we'll meet you in the skiff first. We can get these deep details from you. And then we'll have you before Congress. And everybody said, oh, no, we're sick. We got sick. Lou was sick. David Grush was sick and all these people because they don't want to go on record in the skiff with this stuff. They just want to run the podcast circuit and to say wild things before Congress and say, ooh, I'll talk to you about the real thing in the skiff. So a lot of those people are controlled, and the flow of that information is controlled by the DoD billionaire Chris Mellon. I know that firsthand from my conversations with Grush. And I've put that out, people are aware of it. And there's, this guy was the mayor of Area 51. I mean, what more do you want? You can't have people like that in charge of UFO disclosure unless you want phony CIA disclosure. So it's very important who occupies these positions in terms of leadership. And that brings me to the fact that Loeb, when he first set up the Galileo project, it's very interesting. Loeb, he had the ability to pack it with science people and to really go somewhere. And he assigned all CIA, intelligence community, NGA, and NRO, and CIA, and Lou and Chris at the very top of the whole thing. And so instantly you knew that thing was bought and paid for. But he gets a lot of attention from, kind of corporate media. And he's always rolling out this whole threat thing. And he originally did the threat thing with Oumuamua. Now, the thing that they're really trying to push right now is this AI aspect of these UFO threats. And that the comet thing that's coming in, his particular role is to take it from a different thing of like, Lou Elizondo being like, I need to defend my country and that whole thing, to take it into, ooh, there's a malicious AI moving in and we need our AI to battle it, or that advanced AI is going to come in and float over us. This 3i Atlas AI is going to float over us and say, you need to have a carbon tax, but one of the things he did, and there's a guy out there on Twitter, and Chris Michaels, who sent this to me, which was the Loeb scale classification levels, and which is exactly like a good old Homeland Security chart. Wow. With the, you're in the red, you're in the yellow, watch out. And I'll go right for the red because they're all interesting to read, in fact, but some of the categorization I think is interesting. When you're in the red, you are direct investigation confirms extraterrestrial artificial origin. No collision trajectory. Confirmed extraterrestrial artificial origin, impact trajectory with regional consequences. Confirmed extraterrestrial artificial origin, impact trajectory with global terrestrial consequences. So, Loeb says himself as the grand poobah up over there. He's kind of trying to be a mix of J. Allen Hynek and Carl Sagan. And for me, the entire idea is that they needed to generate this threat from above. The sky event is crucial, the space event, because that is the whole aspect that brings on the emergency powers aspect. If you don't have a sky event, you can have other things. And I'm going to actually read about a whole group that was set up called Critic that could bring in COG through other things like cyber terrorism, or a blackout, or whatever it would happen to be. So our understanding around the continuity of government program, where it comes from, we've laid it out at times on this show and tried to connect it in with how they view the UFO file. In a situation like this, where they're bringing this threat in for the fall and they're putting Loeb up there as the grand poobah, and we know that Loeb is still in that same circle with Mellon and Elizondo and Gary Nolan and that whole gang, that it becomes extra important to understand what emergency powers are. They basically are the final resort of a group that can't get power at the ballot box and they can't govern. So they need emergency powers in order to rule. It's a very different circumstance. And I'm going to show how Nazi Germany itself had a continuity of government program, and how ours kind of got brought about in a benevolent fashion through Eisenhower and Truman as a way to survive a nuclear exchange, but got hijacked. And by the time you get to the Kennedy administration, you were dealing with COG people really, in a push-pull power struggle with the executive branch. And a lot of people involved in the Kennedy assassination worked directly in with that continuity of government group. I've identified the Secret Service agent, Winston Lawson, who set up the route. Well, he had just come out of the White House communications emergency piece. So he was in the nuclear COG version of the day. And it's very interesting because it was noted by Professor Scott in his own research around Winston Lawson, which I think is fascinating, and I highly recommend it as the gold standard for understanding these deep events, all the way from the Kennedy assassination to COVID and Golden Dome or whatever they're building up to now. But it's very interesting because Winston Lawson was using the White House emergency communications setup during the trip. That wasn't something that the Secret Service did. They never used that channel. Those channels were reserved for actual emergencies. I'm going to show you where that emergency procedure comes in with Watergate and the gathering of the tapes and all the information and knowing what Nixon had on tape, because they had a backup system listening to him. And that COG thing is very interesting because in Nixon's period of time, for some reason, instead of that underground thing being so important, they had offshore ships that were carrying and getting this information. And one of the things that people who looked back on this, the deep researchers like Jim Hogan and others, they found that people like Bob Woodward, who came out of the blue, with the Watergate story, with Deep Throat and all that other stuff, they painted that entire thing very, very differently because of his own intelligence training, that Woodward was actually associated with this COG model, and that the COG pouring in the different things from the Nixon White House off to this offshore boat were feeding info to Woodward. And that the person, very, very interestingly, who we spotlighted in X Series 200, which was Admiral Bobby Inman, CIA Director Inman, NSA Director Inman, Hogan, in his book, determined that Inman was Deep Throat. Then think about Inman's involvement with the UFO file. Then think about Inman giving the Career Achievement Medal to George Ioannidis, who we recently revealed, after pushing the corporate media on this for a decade or so, that Ioannidis, now it's exposed through the JFK Records Act, that Ioannidis created the Patsy, Lee Harvey Oswald project. He created the legend. So when you piece those things together, you see continuity of government as a group that's active throughout all of these deep events in American history and influencing policy of the world. The question is, where's that interface of the continuity of government group with the secret space activities? Those two things brought together. The only thing you really have to do is take the lack of oversight and the complete kind of flouting of authority from this group that's running this very large scale underground government and flip that secrecy into space. Yeah, you can apply the exact same rules. So The problem really is between the secret inner government group and the public covert group. This is the battle, and it's gone on in so many different ways, and it's developed so many titles over the years. Professor Scott's title, I believe, is best, which is Deep State. Of course, there's the aspects of the breakaway civilization, which actually is a very interesting way to look at it. The breakaway group, some say that's a more appropriate term when it comes to these things. The X-Protect group is something identified, which was the group that got rid of people who got too close to the UFO file. And they didn't always eliminate them through assassination, although some certainly were assassinated. But sometimes they just destroy their reputations, discredit them, bring them down in some way, cause problems in their lives and take them off the board. And in some cases, the X-Protect group could act in a very lethal fashion. And a lot of the stories about Men in Black and things of this nature come out of that milieu because there are a number of things that are used which aren't common to ordinary people in terms of the types of technologies, psychic technologies, remote viewing, other things that are brought to bear in a situation like that. At a certain point, I termed them the astral, an aspect of what X-Protect does as an astral agency. And the reason for that is at times, the people who are involved with these things would have very intense spectral warnings not to go any further in their research and things of this. So we need to take the full gamut when we look at this and not just limit it. It's very important to understand what goes along with the exotic technology, how it relates to the UFO file, and how does that kind of influence the real politic, as Henry Kissinger would say. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. This is X Series 201. Can you believe it? In fact, there are 280 X Series episodes, along with 300 some odd Dark Journalist shows, because it's all the same thing, really. But in terms of the X Series, it's funny because there are supplementary episodes that are about Round X. So you do episode 180 and have 3 parts of it. So there's 280 episodes. Can you believe it? I don't even want to think about it, really. And the truth is, in terms of this kind of research, I barely have got, I'm starting to get to some of the really key core things, but there's so much material that we have to cover in this show. Of course, one of the things I want to point out that we're going to do later is, of course, is our whole back and forth, the Q&A. And I really want your opinion about what's coming in here in terms of what they're setting up to do in the fall with the UFO file and this whole thing around a threat. I'm going to read some comments from some of these officials who were doing it. But before I do, Miss Olivia, what do you got?
Philip B says, Talpiot is not intelligence. It is an elite R&D branch of the IDF. Talpiot recruits genius-level candidates. Lobe was involved in advanced propulsion research in Israel.
Yes, but they have an intelligence. They're run by intelligence. So, it's just like the CIA has a technical wing. It is run under intelligence. So Talpiot is classified as an intelligence group in Israel. And that's what Lobe is associated with. What else you got?
Humanarum says Avi Lobe is a plasma physicist. He might be read into many different black budget projects.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. But he's also gone along with the whole UFO threat thing. That's where the rub is. So by lining himself up and, these guys giving each other awards and stuff, Mellon and Lobe, this is a joint effort. They'll come in through science. They'll come in through guys like Elizondo who say there's a threat out there. They'll come in through Gary Nolan, who says, hey, Fauci's the best, all of his incredible accomplishments. And then we're supposed to take him seriously as, a trusted UFO scientist. So they have their people lined up. Now, I would assume in a normal situation, like let's suppose there was some kind of a public push in the 80s and 90s. And certainly Hynek was one of them who wanted to come at the UFO thing from the experiencer's side and wanted to come at it and integrate the science and all the different fields. And so a lot of interesting names came up in the middle of that. And some people just tolerated each other from different fields. But this is such a manipulated situation with one goal. And you find it very often with a lot of the congressional people as well. And this is part of the problem, which is you hear these congressional people who have no idea about UFOs at all. They probably just picked up the subject in the last 6 months. But somebody is whispering in their ear back there, UAP, slush fund, the money's coming in, the money train's coming in, just get on the bandwagon and talk about this stuff. And they don't know anything about the topic. This is the nature of the problem. And that's where I think the independent media could have been important in all this, but the independent media got into the nonsense of rolling these people out. So now you're stuck with a bunch of counterintelligence type narratives stuck into the UFO story. And it had a credibility problem, say 20 years ago, just based on the fact that, some of the stories weren't credible or had been discredited on purpose. And so there was a buildup there, but there was a buildup towards disclosure, I'd say, in 3 different occasions: the 60s, the 70s, and the 90s, really, and maybe late in the 80s. So there have been these buildups, but the real controlled disclosure thing, the version that they've had since 2017, is a totally different animal. This thing is run completely by CIA, NGA. The entire intelligence community has rolled their people out, and they've used the media and they've said, look, on the media side, just change everything that you've said in the past. When you've said in the past that, UFOs, the information, the evidence looks like they don't exist, now say that it might, and quote all these CIA people. That's what they're up to. So either way we lose, all CIA disclosure or them blocking the truth in the beginning. Make no mistake that our position, my position directly on this is, of course, there's a UFO file. And of course, that's the real thing that's being hidden there. And so the false version of disclosure is what we're having so many issues with. And that thing is rigged to centralize the control for some kind of sky event, emergency threat. And it comes along with emergency powers. You see, they've vested themselves. I've observed their continuity of government program for a number of years because I was tipped off to it by Professor Scott's work originally when I was in college. And so I've been in that for a long, long time, and I've seen the ramp up. I've seen it go from when I was doing shows with Professor Scott in 2014. That's 10 years ago. And we were talking all about it, that barely anyone talked about the deep state. You never heard continuity of government. As a matter of fact, in certain government circles, you couldn't say it. You couldn't even bring it up in Congress. So the fact that they got comfortable laying it out themselves, at the same time laying out the UFO thing and making that palatable, meant that they were ready to use some of it. That's what kind of sparked my interest about the period we were in history. This is a quote from Chris Mellon, who now says we need to get to the bottom of that UFO thing, and real disclosures out there, everybody. And as the DoD billionaire has controlled the whistleblowers, told them where they could go, what shows they could go on, where they could, if they could go to Congress or come on this show, whatever it is that iron fist in the background. So I've identified Mellon for that. This is what he had to say. 2016. Are you ready? I highly doubt DoD or any other government agency is concealing UFO information. I participated in a comprehensive review of DoD's black programs and spent over a decade conducting oversight of the National Foreign Intelligence Program. An almost totally separate world of secrets. I visited Area 51. He actually directed Area 51. And other military intelligence and research facilities. He was known as the mayor of Area 50. During all those years, I never detected the faintest hint of government interest or involvement in UFOs. That's an undeniable quote of Chris Mellon, 2016. So what changed? Why did he become the person who's whipping up the UFO threat and, those UFOs are so real? because that's 2016, and he changed his mind and threw in with the TTSA and all those people in 2017. What changed? The orders got changed, and that's what happened there with him. So I told you the week was weird. When we started the week off, this was the quote from Dr. Mellon. RFK Jr. had a briefing, and all of this stuff is true. Roswell, all those things, whether they're time travelers and they're humans coming back, or they're from another dimension, or they're whatever, fill in the blank, but apparently it's real. Dr. Mellon came out with that on Monday. So, Dr. Mellon works for Bobby Kennedy. He knows what's going on there. So if he says, well, these FBI agents told me that Bobby got briefed on UFOs and that Roswell's real and all that stuff, then you can pretty much take that to the bank. What's interesting is we've put so much attention around Roswell, and it's very important. I believe Roswell for a number of reasons, but Roswell in particular, when we're talking about it in this vein, some of the things that came up in my own research in a series called Roswell Reignited, and I got some excellent commentary on Roswell Reignited from Walter Bosley, who we did a great interview with recently. We'll have him back on the show, and Dr. Farrell, and their own interesting perspectives were very interesting in their interviews on that when I gave them some of the very strange facts, including the fact that the Deputy Boone, who went into the Texas School Book Depository during the, while the assassination was going on in 1963, he is the same person who ran the Foster business for the Foster Ranch people who owned the Roswell Ranch. And this became an incredible crisscross with the Church of Christ and all of these other pieces. And as that opened up, when you realize these two major historical incidents separated by 16 years, the Roswell UFO crash and the JFK assassination, that the same person is involved at the core of both, because he's working for the Fosters who own the ranch. And he also is the person who goes into the Texas School Book Depository and say, hey, look, it's Oswald's gun. I got that information from a whistleblower named Dorothy, who, has a very kind of high-level professional job and was very worried about being recognized. So we're still working on how to bring her out to the public. But the facts that she presented about Boone, and who was almost kind of like a stepdad to her, really, growing up, and the fact that she lived in the among the Foster, because the Fosters run these Christian children's homes, and the people that work for them, live there. And so there's a whole piece here that I think is fascinating and will open up the story dramatically. But what was interesting for me was when she told me, the Fosters, one of the things in those Christian homes that happens is there's a lot of UFO abduction activity. And, it's also interesting that so much of this takes place in Stevensville, Texas, which we know is a real hotspot for UFO activity, and also close to W's Ranch and all the rest of it. And when they had that major flap in 2008, they called in all kinds of security when those UFOs, because they thought the UFOs were way too close to Bush's ranch. And this is when Bush was on his way out of the presidency. So there's so many explosive things in that series that we're doing, Roswell Reignited. And I can say that, sometimes when you do this work, you're shocked at the level of things that you find out or discover in the middle of it all. And I can tell you that this is one of those earthquakes that's going on. But it is very odd, because before Mellon was talking about RFK and Roswell, there was the New York Times article from a week previous, which started to talk about Roswell and said, Roswell's been proven to be a cover-up where the government pretended it was a balloon, but it was actually some kind of exotic alien technology that crashed. They put it in the article. So something is going on there. The thing that is getting built up is the disclosure end of it, is that something is going to come out and it's going to go back to the very core of this entire thing, which is the Roswell incident. And somehow, our Roswell Reignited series is coming in just as they're doing this. I also think is. I mentioned that J.D. Vance, he of the Peter Thiel pedigree, Peter Thiel's taken a great interest in Vance, and Vance may have a lot of good qualities to bring forward anyway. But certainly the Thiel technological thing, they think that they have their claws in him. And Thiel, again, I've identified him because of the Palantir work as very shady. That's very shady stuff. But I don't put him on a level with like a George Soros type of demagogue type thing. But it's very, very questionable. And so you get a lot of that pushing into the independent media as well. So it's something to keep an eye on. I'd say. But here he is, J.D. Vance, obsessed with UFOs.
Obsessed.
Says he plans to get to the bottom of mystery sightings.
Wow.
Unbelievable. And we started off with this, like, this is a major thing for a VP to say. And of course, it was followed up immediately by our friend Tulsi, as I mentioned. Hey, aliens are real. I just can't tell you about it, While Gabbard declined in her new interview to elaborate on any classified intel, she suggested that she still had unanswered questions about the mysterious drones spotted buzzing over neighborhoods in New Jersey last year. Well, they came right back to Trump and said, what about this? You said you were going to get to the bottom of it. What happened? What were they? What the hell was going on there? Well, Trump says, I found out about it, but I can't tell you about it. I wish I could, but it's all taken care of. It's not a problem. Let me tell you how much of a problem it was. President-elect Trump decided when this was going on to put large drone destroyers on top of his motorcades when he was driving around. So if one of those things showed up, he was going to blast it out of the sky because they started hanging over Bedminster. And, in New Jersey, which is Trump's home away from home. And I'll tell you, it was very interesting because a lot of things came up around New Jersey in that period. And then I found out that Spielberg was filming his UFO movie. And guess who was the consultant aide who was there helping him along? It's apparently is even a focus in the movie as kind of one of the characters or one of the people doing the voiceover. Lulu Elizondo. You got Paulina Luna, you got Lulu Elizondo. So, that's just interesting. But there again,
or an op, right?
Yes. Oh, yeah. It could be. It could be.
Mhm.
One of the things I would say is that's a non-answer from Trump on that. It's very telling. But the independent media made a lot of mistakes when the whole drone thing was happening because they were trying to throw in with the people who were saying, oh, it's misidentification of planes. No, we go through all the time. In the last month, have you heard of massive misidentification of planes? No, right? In November, December, the drones were all over the place and they were hanging over the East Coast and they were buzzing military bases. We know the whole reports came out of Langley. There was a whole report by the head of continuity of government, General Gio, who comes out of Fort McDill, which is, by the way, where all the, all the Roswell stuff and all the alien body stuff supposed to have landed right in Fort McDill there in Florida. So that signature around the continuity of government leaders, the previous one had been part of the 509th group, which is in the lineage. The 509th was the original group that found the Roswell material. So this might be a kind of initiatory thing we're looking at where they have to have some direct link. They have to have seen the stuff. And I'll just say this as far as articles go, because I mentioned the New York Times bringing up the Roswell thing. Well, they also did a little fight back against the Wall Street Journal. And the Wall Street Journal put out this article being like, oh, yeah, all the UFO stuff is so phony. It's just, us testing advanced technology, and Area 51 was just set up to test this stuff out, and that's what people saw. And it was so ridiculous and a horribly researched article. But the only good thing about it was taking people like Elizondo or Corbell or whatever to task. However, what happens very often is they try to throw the entire subject out with one article, and the people were not very well researched, which is odd for the Wall Street Journal. Now, here's what's interesting to me about that. The New York Times felt the need to hit back. So we can see the New York Times is on the CIA false disclosure side, and the Wall Street Journal guys are like, no, put it all back in the box. Neither one of them are getting anywhere near the truth. The independent media has an opportunity, but has to wake up to the opportunity. And it has to wake up to the number of intel people working around the UFO clock in the field. And you can't let those people, come out and just spew this, kind of whistleblower stuff and be like, oh, I'm risking my life or whatever, when in fact they're not risking anything. Nothing has happened to any of these guys. They haven't gotten arrested or anything like that. Or they haven't been told, Elizondo put out this whole imminent book, right? I call it Imminent BS. And, that book is cleared by the military. They don't care about that thing. That's him saying that he saw an apparition at the end of his bed. St. Lou. It's astral travel Lou. Here we go. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. Woo. Now, dismantling the UFO file deep event that's incoming and associated with this 3-eye atlas. That's the core of this episode 201 of the X series. And I can tell you that I haven't even, just wait to some of the things they're going to reveal in this episode around this whole wave. I want to remind you also that we're going to take your questions in the second half of the program, so you can ask them now. Miss Olivia will put them together. What do you got?
All right, let's get down to it. Quantum Paradox wants to know, tell me, what do you think 3-eye atlas is?
Well, like a Muamua, I mean, it's, it's an anomaly from another system. Our equipment is also a lot better. Now, this is part of the whole upgrade of our space senses. I thought it was hilarious when the Chinese balloon got through and NORAD was like, oh, we're so busy looking for big things that we didn't know about balloons coming in, but now we'll tweak our senses. We'll be able to see those balloons from now on. So, NORAD, the kind of father of lies out there. But the like a Muamua, the 3-eye atlas thing is it's an anomalous space anomaly. And what they like to do is data mine, especially with the Sky event. So they data mined the heck out of the drone explosion, and how the public would respond. See, this was different. You had military bases being buzzed, yes, including Wright-Patterson, which is a major UFO hangar. But you also were buzzing the public with this. And people were like, it felt like, there were motorcycles on top of my house in New Jersey. If you go back and really listen to those accounts, those neighborhoods are basically being terrorized. They were meant to go to the news and be like, what's going on here? And the Stepford Biden administration, they didn't have anything to say about it. At least Trump admits that it was going on and that, he's like, I can't talk about it. Sorry, But in my opinion, this was part of the Homeland Synchronizer program that was under Northcom that they did an exercise for, which was what would happen if this thing came through. And they actually called it in their own setup UAP versus UAS. So unmanned drones versus UFOs. That's what they were doing. There's all kinds of data for them doing it all the way through October, November. And then boom, you have this big explosion. And everybody talked about it because you could see it everywhere. And I saw it here. So, the people who just got into this habit of saying, oh, it was just people misidentifying. No, it was a swarm. It was a massive swarm for months. So they got incredible data from that. And regional data to figure it out. So they fed that back into Northcom NORAD to see how did people respond to this thing when the government didn't say anything about it, but it was hanging out over their, people could see it off their plane wing and stuff like that. I have plenty of pictures of those. So they got plenty from that. They got plenty from the Chinese balloon fiasco. And then the Lake Michigan thing, all the headlines read, UFO shot down. And then they were like, oh, yeah, we'll show you the footage of what we found. And then later they were like, oh, it must have been an observational balloon. We shot it down. And no one ever showed any footage of that. They showed footage eventually of the Chinese balloon thing, but it was, they had this Chinese balloon just stalking across the United States. They let it go on its merry way. That's never, ever happened before. You knew you're in deep territory there. So we're looking at it from that perspective. We can see what the nature, the aim of it is. They need the data for how the sky event, the sky emergency works. Here's a little more on that front. Actually, that's the headline. UFO shot down by U.S. fighter jet found on Lake Huron's shoreline. Okay, there were tons of headlines like this. The New York Times had headlines like this. So they're saying UFOs shot down here. These are major publications. They're using the term. They want to see, how do people react to this idea of UFOs showing up in the sky and us shooting them down? So they need more telltale data about if the public will buy it as well. That's part of the narrative massaging, as it were. And there was one more on that front. In recently released documents, Canadian police found debris from a UFO that had been taken down near Lake Huron last year. UFO was shot down by a U.S. F-16 fighter jet on February 12th, 2023. This reports from summer 2024. This and the third UFO incident to have taken place in North America, and the original one in February 2023. This is part of the wave. The object is said to have been an octagon shape with strings hanging off. The fighter jet shot the UFO twice, striking it with one missile before it fell into Canadian waters. And the wreckage was found on the shoreline of Lake Huron. The discovery was never made public. So, they accomplished their mission with whatever they were doing. Then, immediately after that, with those headlines, we got U.S. recovered non-human biologics from UFO crash sites. That was the Grush op, Mellon in the background, pushing that whole thing. And Grush thought, oh, I'm being shown real stuff here. And he, as part of the UAP task force and all the rest, he thought, because when I was talking to him, he believed what they were feeding him. And when I told him, the bit about Chris Mellon, he was genuine trepidation. He was very nervous about what Chris Mellon would do if he found out I was talking to him. And I was basically like, if you have something to say to the public, we'll do it on my show. And he was like, you don't understand the repercussions. So Mellon is controlling that whole thing. It's very important to note that. But before that even happened, in May of 2023, something very important took place. And Grush was May as well. This was the intelligence community leaders meeting at Wright-Patterson for historic national security briefing run by Avril Haines. And it got all the big shots. They were talking about the whole sky emergency thing. That's why it was at Wright-Pat. And it was an extraordinary gathering of the top intel people. Right after that, we got the whole Grush show and we got the whole biologics thing. And that was very interesting because, the congressional people, they didn't know what hit them. They were just like trying to get something going there. And those congressional people know very little about the topic. I don't expect them to. But when they come out and they're like, here's a UAP bill or whatever, you have to ask them, where did you learn about the subject in the first place? What facts do you know about it? Who gave you those? That whole UAP Disclosure Act and all that run by Chuck Schumer, you're not going to get really good details out of Chuck Schumer, are you? When we look at it from that perspective, we can see it's organized political action. And they're trying to create a policy and create the UFO Defense Office through the National Disclosure, the NDAA. And once they do that, they attach it to the NDAA, then it's going to be something you can't get rid of. So they did that with Arrow originally. That was a small scale version, which Marco Rubio got through. But the National Defense Authorization Act, what it does is it has about $1 trillion worth of spending for the military. So if you have this little office thing, you say you have to, we're the Senate Intelligence Committee, you have to put this UFO Defense Office in there. If you don't, we'll hold up the whole bill. Then all of these people in all of these different groups freak out because they're like, hey, where's our money? You're blocking our money. And, they just say, well, they won't allow this piece to be run through. The Senate Intelligence Committee recommended it. So this is what they're up to. And they've been very successful up to now. Now, let's jump ahead from that timeline for a moment and talk about this interim NASA director giving us the whole heads up that the moon is going to go nuclear. Are you ready for this? Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X-Series 201. We're going to nuke the moon, everyone. It's the UFO File Deep Event incoming. Free Eye Atlas, Avi Lobe, and the Mellon gang going deep here tonight. I'm going to open up how the continuity of government piece is related directly to the secrecy around the UFO file, how these things meld in this kind of bizarre corridor between aerospace and intelligence and corporate groups around the world, but definitely in America. We're going to be taking your questions in the second half of the program. I also want to remind you, if you're new here especially, go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter. It's a free newsletter, and it keeps us in touch through all the heavy censorship that we're seeing, and it's going to let you know about some incredible things we have coming up for you later this summer and into the fall. Mind-blowing track of content programming like you wouldn't believe, documentaries, docuseries, and presentations. The whole bit is going to be in there, and it's for you for free. So you can't beat that. Go to darkjournalist.com right now and do it. Stand up and be counted. Make sure you're on that newsletter list. Yes.
Old Man Junkin says DJ is the lone outpost calling out the deep events.
Listen, one man armed with the truth constitutes a majority. That's what Jim Garrison said. The way that I look at it, though, it is, you will at time when you do certain types of work, you're going to be in the broad stroke of things. Even if you are the lone outpost pushing it, you're going to, all of those kind of potent forces that are on the alternative side come together around those. Okay, Sean Duffy, interim director of NASA, the old transportation secretary, got in there because Musk tried to put in a corrupt billionaire to run NASA so that he could get all the data from NASA, make SpaceX invincible. Didn't happen. Trump cut him off at the knees, got rid of that guy, and installed Duffy. And Musk freaked out on him, said, "You're an Epstein files guy." After praising him and helping him get into the White House and the incredible relationship they developed, Musk flipped out, because he realized, I'm not going to get what I thought I was going to get, which is anybody who I want in this administration around space was going to go my way. Trump plays his own cards, and Musk learned that the hard way. But Duffy announces nuclear reactor on the moon. This is what they're going for. This is a problem. There's a lot of problems with it, but also it's very revealing. One of the things we can say about it is that there is an actual treaty, outer space treaty from 1967, that prevents it, because it prevents anything that can be weaponized up there. But I want to bring us back to something related, and this is Project A119. And it's the study of lunar research flights, Air Force Special Weapons Center out of Kirtland, in New Mexico, which a lot of the personnel for the Roswell incident came from. In 1958, the program was to actually send a missile to the moon, explode a nuclear bomb, and, we'll be the first ones up there who did it. And this is very interesting because apparently it caught Senator John F. Kennedy's attention very early on. And what's odd is what I found in the record around the time of that test is Kennedy writing to the very interesting figure in the Air Force and telling him that he wanted all of the information that they had regarding the UFO file and the cases that they had been studying. And the guy, in response, writes back and is basically trying to get around Kennedy, and Kennedy writes him again, trying to get that information. Right around 1958, which is a crucial year because you have the International Geophysical Year, as I've pointed out, so many things happen around there, 57, 58, and you get the first recognition about satellites. Sputnik beat us, right? I don't know about that. It was acknowledged on both sides, something else up there before we put anything up there. So Sputnik might have technically beat the Americans. I think we just let them have it in order to have them come to Antarctica with us in the International Geophysical Year so we could do some kind of what I call UFO espionage, which I think is what they did with the Russian scientists at the time. And I think that Sputnik is interesting because it's whenever you get the public face of the thing, it's fascinating, like the public face of Apollo. But a number of things go on in the background, and that's what we're concerned with, especially at this point, unraveling those things over the course of the past 70 years that have impacted the situation now because we weren't able to get at them before. And the way that the society is running, we don't have the luxury of waiting another 50 years to find out about these things because there's a consolidation program that is on overdrive, I would say. I would say they're driving a good 120 miles an hour in a car on a highway with a 65 mile an hour limit. So that program, I think, was very interesting because they were targeting the moon there for a nuclear explosion. Now you have the introduction of a nuclear reactor on the moon because they're going to need power supplies there that are obvious. Because they're not going to be able to justify, what are you doing up there? How are you doing all these things if you don't have a nuclear reactor up there? Because they have a separate energy source, in my opinion. That's part of the twist of all this. And I want to get into how they could have kept that private in this whole period and how key figures who were involved in key events, the Kennedy assassination in the period of time, some 60 years ago, is a fantastic snapshot of this because they had to expose themselves to a degree in order to turn the world in this whole completely different direction. But they left all these players out there and they left all these plans out there that could be dissected and understood. And it takes a long time to uncork those types of psyops on that level. And that's what we're seeing in the case of the Kennedy assassination with some of the records coming out and even the Joanides records, although it's not even well understood, nor is it very complete by a long shot. But what we do have at least is that understanding on the record that the Central Intelligence Agency were involved in setting up Oswald. That's important on the record. The researchers all knew it, but fundamentally the history of the thing now has a very solid piece of history there. So this bit about putting a nuclear reactor on the moon also combines with the Golden Dome. And this is going to bring us directly into the Corso quotes that I've chosen for tonight, which come from his book, The Day After Roswell, which he wrote. And he was assisted in the process by Bill Burns, who had to kind of manage it for public presentation. And he had run like UFO magazine. He was in a show called UFO Hunters and things. But for writing purposes, where Corso wanted to come out of the gate and really bring all the truth out at once, they wanted to massage it so it would fit into a kind of acceptable narrative. And now I'll tell you that I've seen the original manuscript of what Corso wrote. And so I have some idea of what changes were injected. Uh, and for me, it seems just that the overemphasis on the grays and what we did with them seems to be parts of the addition there. But in terms of Corso's story and what he's laying out, Corso was who he said he was, and he was a major protege of General Trudeau, and Trudeau was deep, deep in that system. And he was, an investigator for Senator Strom Thurmond. He did work for the Warren Commission. He worked in intelligence through all of these different branches of government. So he knew what he was talking about, and he was a major honcho at the Foreign Technology Office. And that is where they moved things through the government. And the UFO file technology piece, that's where that got moved. So that's why Corso is very, very important. And his story, I think, has been like another major figure that we're going to discuss tonight. His story has been left because people have not been able to digest it or understand where he was coming from. Also, the story of Corso, there's not a lot of charisma going on with Corso. That's the way I describe it. He's a hard figure, to really, you can't warm up to him. And
yeah, he's visually unimpressive.
Visually, he has a lot of issues. And I think this was part of the problem with Corso, which is he spoke in this, kind of broken intelligence style of an older, grumpy guy kind of thing. And it broke a lot of the fascinating material he was bringing forward. But at the end of his life, he was dissatisfied with where the field was and where the truth of things were. And actually, as I went through very, very carefully with everything that Corso had on the record, I could verify most of it. So therefore, in my opinion, he was coming from a very, very important place with material. So let's get to some of his quotes and how some interesting quotes I found that are rare from Marcel himself coincide with this, and how the Roswell reignited piece really fits in with all this. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X Series 201. It is the UFO file deep event incoming. Here comes that CIA UFO threat. Of course, the UFO file is real, but they want false disclosure. Never forget the difference. There's the real thing and there's the false thing. And the 3-eye atlas, of course, with Avi Lobe, this is their other way of doing it. It's like, hey, it's going to be, it's not loose, dangerous UFOs out there. It's one big, lumbering, alien-controlled craft that is along the lines of a comet that's a threat to the whole entire world. And so let's see how far they can take this. Originally, he was saying, oh, it's going to come, we're going to see it on Halloween. How perfect was that?
Mhm.
Now they're saying, no, it's more like around Christmas. So look, the Roswell story is absolutely real. One, something major crashed, and it looks like it had two different crashes. The second thing is that the figures involved with Roswell research have done a lot of good work on the ground with it over the years, including the late Stanton Friedman. The other thing is the people who say, oh, they just let out some story about aliens as a distraction and that was part of a psyop, don't seem to understand that the story that went out of it being a flying saucer crash was only out for 4 hours before they changed the version of the newspaper. So you're not going to run a psyop just with a 4-hour thing before you change it to a weather balloon. That doesn't make any sense. So the switch and the people shutting down the story happened quickly. If you tried to broadcast that story and you were in Roswell, people came into your broadcast and said, stop broadcasting at this moment. Don't talk about this crash and all the rest of it. So it was a controlled event. They tried to shut it down, and they shut it down for 30 years. Roswell event doesn't exist in literature from 47 to 79. 78, there's, maybe it's the first real rumbling. Oddly enough, in the middle of all that, The Man Who Fell to Earth comes out. And The Man Who Fell to Earth is all about this alien who lands in Roswell and revolutionizes industry. That's David Bowie and Thomas Jerome Newton. But what's interesting is most of Man Who Fell to Earth was shot in Roswell. So somebody knew something. And the author, Walter Tevis, very interesting author, he did not set it in Roswell. So it was the director who set it in Roswell. So he knew something very important. As the story goes, a rancher originally saw a lot of debris on his ranch. That rancher is Mac Brazel. Mac Brazel, his history was very solid, and he was just a guy who was running the ranch for the Fosters. The Fosters, who did pretty well in oil and in Texas, had that setup of a children's orphanage, Christian orphanages. They became fabulously wealthy after the Roswell incident. And apparently, the idea was the government said, look, we're taking the ranch. Here's what we're going to offer you. And the Foster said, no, we have all these plans for the ranch. And, the ranch wasn't even any great shakes. I'm not sure why they were fighting so hard for it, but the government said, look, we'll give you, now I know for sure that they gave them land rights for an oil field, but I've heard that they gave them a gold mine also, and this became part of them becoming fabulously wealthy. Now remember, it's going to be 16 years later when the person who finds the rifle on the 6th floor of the depository and says it's Oswald's rifle and all that, but this guy will, a few years after that, become the person who runs all of the Foster children's Christian homes. He becomes their CEO, and that is Eugene Boone. Interesting thing about Eugene Boone, I'll say as an aside, and this is in the Roswell Reignited show. Boone identifies the rifle as a Mauser in the Texas School Book Depository, 7.65 Mauser. Seymour Weitzman, who runs gun store, identifies it as a 7.65 Mauser. He would know, he runs a gun store. Roger Craig said the bottom of the barrel said 7.65 Mauser. So there's 3 cops, 3 out of the 4 that get in there initially. They all say it's a Mauser. Oswald's gun supposedly was this Arcano, and the one that they were able to tag to him and all the rest of it. So whatever mix-up is going on there with the gun is very interesting and indicative, but Boone is part of that mixed messaging. And he will have to later say, I made a mistake. So we have to kind of remember these people as they move through history and what these events are about. Now, with that in mind, I want to mention that 2 people associated at the highest level with the Roswell incident were, one apparently was assassinated and the other one barely escaped assassination. And that one was Jesse Marcel. That's what I'm going to get to next. But before I do that, Miss Olivia, what do you got?
I don't know. I'm just thinking of the old Disney movie Escape to Witch Mountain.
Oh, yeah.
And which is 2 orphaned alien children who don't remember because they've been in an accident. They have these flashback memories that they're aliens, and they call themselves castaways. And I just am putting 2 and 2 together with the Fosters and the
Yeah. Well, there are a lot of very interesting people associated with the Fosters and the Church of Christ. And I've tried to do it in a way that, see, the curiosity for me is that whatever the Fosters were doing when they were running the Roswell ranch, and they could have been just running it as a regular sheep ranch, but when this craft crashes, and, let's just say for purposes that it is an alien crash, whatever it is that crashes there seems to follow them back to those orphanages. Because the whistleblower that I had, who gave me so much information about the Fosters and such, told me about these abductions that took place there in the foster Christian homes. So somehow this alien abduction thing was happening there. But again, it's the Fosters who are, the same people who had the ranch. And it's interesting because the ranch the next year they had a designation which made it toxic. It was like, don't try to grow anything here, or, don't try to have cattle here and all that kind of stuff. They changed that eventually. And I learned a lot from reading some of the final notes of Jesse Marcel about that. And they now, give tours and things of the Roswell spot. It's very interesting about Marcel. I'll tell you what happened with him in the 2 assassination attempts, one successful against his co-pilot, one not successful against him after the incident. So here is Marcel at the end of his life with his wife, kind of getting memoir type stuff together. And if I told you that he had very interesting visitors like Carol O'Connor, Archie Bunker goes to visit this, takes him to Hollywood, hangs out with him, and guess what he has to say? I want you on my show. I'll pay you $10,000 a week.
A week?
To be on my show. Marcel's not an actor. At the time, he had emphysema. It's very strange that the buyout thing for Marcel, when he comes out public and talks about the Roswell incident, is Carol O'Connor, who's a huge star. And that's in Marcel's own diary notes. It's in this final interview he gave. Somehow Archie Bunker comes and he wants to give Marcel all this money. I found out it was very, very strange one. Very, very strange. And I found out when I went through the various acting roles that Carol O'Connor had, that he had played an alien. He played an alien with an English accent in Outer Limits who was changing the fabric of time and space. I don't know what was going on there, or who was trying to throw Jesse Marcel off from telling his Roswell story, but they were using Carol O'Connor to do it.
Do you think they were paying him off?
Well, he says it's $10,000 a week. That's serious money in 1979.
Mm-hmm.
And also putting him on the show, which is, the Archie Bunker All in the Family thing, very highly rated show. What could they really do with Jesse Marcel, who didn't even act?
Right. And,
wasn't at his at a vital point in his life. I mean, it's very, very strange. So here's the setup. Marcel and another heavy hitter putting together the wreckage, the guy who flew the wreckage to Wright Field, Kane Jennings. Very interesting man in his own right. There's a story that Marcel wants to tell at the end of his life to a college student. And I'm going to read it directly from the tape transcript. And what happens is he is set to go from Roswell and fly, where he's stationed. And he's supposed to fly over to this point in Paris, which is where Lindbergh landed in his famous transatlantic flight. And I'll just read a few things here. Let's see if this all clicks in with us. Everyone, you're watching The Dark Journal's X Series 201. This is the UFO File Deep Event incoming. We're getting deep into Jesse Marcel and some of his final thoughts, some of the very unusual things that he tells at the end of his life. I was scheduled for a flight to Europe nonstop with Lieutenant Colonel Payne Jennings. You see this fellow right here. He shows a picture of him like I just. We're going to go to Europe. Now, I don't know whether I'd be a co-pilot navigator or what. It was just we had this B-29 fully loaded with gasoline, and I was scheduled to fly with him to Europe. Our first landing would be Le Bourget Air Dome in France, in Paris. That morning, we were supposed to take off at 10, but at 9 o'clock, he called me. Marcel pointed again to the picture of Jennings. Then he pointed to Colonel Blanchard's picture. He was my commanding officer, Colonel Blanchard. He's from Boston. Shout out.
Mhm.
He's deceased now, to my dismay. He was one of the finest commanding officers I've ever worked with. Well, anyway, I was supposed to take off with him. I had everything packed, just ready to go, when he called me on the telephone and said, Jesse, he said, just stay here in Roswell. I said, yes, sir. I said, why? He said, you have a VIP that you have to entertain. Who is it? It turned out that it was Charles Lindbergh who was coming over. And then the interviewer says, oh, and did you get to meet Lindbergh? Well, we went to the officers' club and I had to feed him. Was it Lindbergh himself? That must have been an honor. Marcel, I told him I was scheduled to fly to Le Bourget. I think I'm getting that right.
Mm-hmm. That was good.
He said that was the place I landed in the spirit of St. Louis. Le Bourget, it's French. I think it's Toll or something airdrop now just outside of Paris. That's where Lindbergh landed, and I was supposed to land there too. And here, the very man who landed the spirit of St. Louis was there, and I had him with me. Well, what happened then is a real mystery, because this Colonel Payne Jennings, and they've got another guy who was flying co-pilot for them, either the co-pilot or the navigator, and they took off. And once they crossed the east coast of Florida, they were never heard from again. They went into the Bermuda Triangle.
Whoa.
This is Marcel talking about the fate of Payne Jennings, who's the one who flies the wreckage to Fort Worth. The Bermuda Triangle, they were never heard from. Now, I would have been on that plane, you understand? Had it not been for Colonel Lindbergh coming over. She, my wife, knows that story. And then the interviewer says, strange events. Gosh, well, good you're telling me this stuff that's not in the book. Oh, that's right, says Jesse. I've got a hell of a lot I could tell you that's not in the Roswell book, which is the famous LISZT book about the Roswell incident. Now, if you go into the official history about what happened to Colonel Payne Jennings, he does in fact disappear, but he disappears while flying somewhere over the Philippines. That's the official story.
That's the opposite direction.
It's the opposite direction. And for some reason, the official story, they didn't want to say Jennings disappeared over the Bermuda Triangle.
Mm-hmm.
So that there's something very big that is taking place there. One, they need to get rid of both of those voices. They need to get rid of Marcel, and they need to get rid of Jennings, because they were both firsthand witnesses. And for some reason, this is an attempt to get rid of them, in my opinion. And the weird thing is, it's Blanchard and Lindbergh that save Marcel. So there's something going on with Marcel, him being the first intelligence officer who finds the Roswell wreckage, and the incredible hieroglyphs and things that he described, and the mile-long footage field saying the thing must have been gigantic. And of course, he finds the incredible so-called memory metal that you can't do anything to. That incredibly important event of Marcel bringing this forward, he has both an angel and a devil looking over his shoulder as he's moving through life. But in that case, he was saved. But Jennings didn't make it through there. I believe Jennings was taken out there, but somehow they used this idea of the Bermuda Triangle for that. So we can find immediately that you're in very unusual waters when you're dealing with the Roswell incident. In fact, it's not the 90s version of the big-headed alien and all that. But that's definitely in the record. There's no question about it. But the story appears to go deeper into the clash of worlds there. And that's what we're going to get to next. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. It's X-Series 201, and we are going deep, deep tonight into the UFO file deep event incoming. And we'll do more on Payne Jennings because I found a few other things in there that I think are very telltale in the case of Jennings. And I do want to point out that at the end of his life, Marcel did his own drawings of the actual hieroglyphs. Funny here. I'm going to remove a note I made on this one. But this is the artist's rendition of what he drew, which are the hieroglyphs that he saw on these strange beams, curved beams. And this is what Marcel drawing that he gave of the actual symbols there.
Right. Those look mathematical.
Very interesting. And he says purple and pink below them. That's his actual signature there.
Mm-hmm.
You know, those hieroglyphs, I think, are very important because we see them show up in the Kecksburg incident. We see different variations of the hieroglyphs come up. And the only way that people can really identify them, sometimes they really do look like Egyptian hieroglyphs. And his wife, Marcel's wife, when she chimes in during that last final conversation, which is in a book called For the Sake of My Country by Linda Corley, and she taped the whole final conversation. And oddly enough, after this wonderful interaction, something strange happens. But what happens is the wife says, I remember looking at them and thinking they looked like Egyptian hieroglyphics. And Marcel says, well, they were symbols that kind of leaned on each other. They looked like some kind of formula. So that was his impression. This to me is absolutely fascinating. What happens is the next day, she's going to come over, this college student again. And I don't know if Jesse was bugged at the time. This was 1980, I believe. But he calls her up and he says, don't come over. And we can't talk. And don't take any of that stuff to the press. Don't talk about it. Don't do anything with it. And she said, what's the problem? And she said it was such a different person on the other end of the phone. So they had spooked Marcel after they heard him talking to this woman. And he does spend a lot of time on those hieroglyphs. And he does also say, you know what? I kept things beyond what I told because I'm an intelligence guy. And for the sake of my country, there were things that I could not reveal. So the whole piece about the bodies that were found, the more you dig into the story, the more it appears that Marcel had he knew about all the different things that were involved. And the story about the bodies themselves are remarkably consistent in terms of the description of the bodies, which are 4 feet tall and with large heads and large eyes. And then the gray thing that comes after that, they do look like grays from the descriptions, but not exactly. They're a little bit different. And that thing about the Asiatic appearance again comes in. And so when you get into that whole thing about quote unquote Asiatic appearance of, this bothered a lot of researchers, and it bothered John Keel in particular. And his research set me off on this incredible tangent about the Sami Laplander people being associated directly with the development of the Men in Black because of their incredible psychic faculty. So, and that's something that goes very deep. But I do think it's interesting that there is a kind of a universal thing when you get around the alien thing. The description, they seem to want to say, well, they look Nordic or they look Asian or whatever it is. And if you really tighten that up and you go to the Sami people like Renee Zellweger, they have this kind of beautiful appearance, but it can appear Asian. It's like, it's this interesting mix, kind of the classic Pleiadian look mixed with a slightly more exotic thing. And I do think that that's interesting, and I think it tells us a lot. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Okay, hold on. I got too many questions already. So Joseph said Corso is highly problematic, but nevertheless needs careful parsing. And Susan Blackstone asked the question I asked earlier, were Carol O'Connor and Jackie Gleason buddies? Did you ever find out the answer to that?
They knew each other in terms of close buddies. I didn't find that, but they certainly knew each other and spun in the same circles.
Well, they're sort of the same generation.
Well, we know that Jackie had his house built like a flying
Exactly.
saucer and had a flying saucer obsession. I listened to a show which was like an early version of Coast to Coast, but it was 1959. And it's the Long John Neville show, of course, which was like the Art Bell before Art Bell. And he has our friend Jackie Gleason on there telling his whole story and talking in depth. And to be honest with you, when I was listening to it, I was like, here it is 60 some odd years later. We haven't come much further in that conversation than what they were having, truthfully. I mean, they were still curious about things, but it's amazing how much the culture has been held back around all of this incredible material around the UFO file. Let's go into Corso a little bit because unlike a lot of people in that UFO field, Bob Lazar and others, he was who he said he was and where he said he was. That's a very important difference. He does have that, he has that very, very strong historical footprint for everything that he did, including his work with the Kennedys, including his work for Strom Thurmond, who wrote the original forward opening for his book before he freaked out when he realized it was about aliens and had to take it out. But the original run of that book has Senator Strom Thurmond, who ran for president as an independent in 1948, and was very, very close friends with Gene Dixon.
Mm-hmm.
Corso, through his various, being stationed in Rome and other intelligence centers, gleaned a great deal about fighting the Russians during the Cold War. And this is his main cause. What happens is his mentor, General Trudeau, comes to him in 1961 and says, I want you to figure out what we can do with the UFO file tech. I want you to assemble a real team and create a massive push around speeding up the redevelopment of this technology. That's what he has to say. I'm going to quote directly from Corso here, and there's some very interesting crossovers with the X-15, which we've brought up on this program. And you have to understand the X-15 is part of that X technology and comes out of the Nazi Germany production hands of Walter Dornberger. So again, we're in the advanced technology corridor, but we're also in the JFK corridor because it is Michael Payne's association at Bell Aerospace with Walter Dornberger that creates this loop because Michael Payne is hosting the Oswalds when they come back from Russia. Here we go. Now, here's Corso. A third Firefly UFO sighting was made on April 30th, 1962 during an X-15 flight by NASA research pilot Joe Walker. By the way, Joe Walker, he's another, in my opinion, X-Protect victim because he reports some very interesting things, and let's see what happens to him. This plane reached an altitude of 246,700 feet. After the X-15 landed, film from the facing camera showed several fireflies. They were described by a NASA spokesman as barbell-shaped, which this is one of the classic formations of these UFOs. Bright orange in color, passing in groups up to 6 behind the X-15. Opinion range from definitely something up there to film spots to sun rays on the lens. The Walker X-15 sighting was publicized in the National Conference of Peaceful Uses of Space. We could use some of those now. And it was held in Seattle, May 10th, 1962. Walker said, "I'm not sure about speculating the nature of these objects. What I do know is what appeared on the film in later study. From what we can tell, they seem to be disc-shaped or perhaps even cylindrical, but it's impossible to estimate their size, their distance from the camera." Soon afterwards, Paul Bickle, the director of the NASA Flight Research Center, said it was either paint, frost, peeling from the fuselage, going back, and he had all these various things. But Walker disagreed with him. And Walker said, well, that's not what it was. Here's a little more on Walker. The September 62 issue of the UFO Investigator, the newsletter of NICAP, carried a short article on a sighting by Major White titled "Air Force Criticizes NASA Release of Mystery Object Photo." These photos are interesting. Major Hart, an AF official UFO spokesman, said, "As usual, NASA has gone out on a limb on this," and added, "The news story was the first intimation that the Air Force had of the problem." The article stated that NASA scientists frankly admitted that they could not explain the object or its presence in space. The release of the photo was described as following a 3-week investigation. The initial sighting by Walker on the April 30th mission and Major White's sighting were both mentioned in NICAP's 1964 report, The UFO Evidence. Major White's sighting was described as being an object like a piece of paper which followed the X-15 and then darted above and behind the plane. The sighting would then be mentioned from time to time over the next 4 decades. Now, it's very interesting because our friend Corso identifies Walker as somebody who was using the X-15 to chase UFOs. And the period of them chasing UFOs is during the Kennedy administration. This is what they were using the X-15 to do. In fact, it's what the X-15 was built for. And the X-15 still had the record as a manned space plane until 2 years ago. X-15 pilot Joe Walker revealed in his 1961 mission in setting a new world airspeed record was also to hunt for UFOs during his high altitude flights. He said he filmed UFOs during an X-15 flight a year later in 1962. Other reports persisted about Mercury 7 astronauts being shadowed by UFOs. Now, he has another sighting in the X-15, and he's not shy about talking about these sightings or speculating about it. The year following, so 63, he has the second sighting. In 64, or it might be 1965 actually, he is doing another setup with the X-15 with another pilot, and they're doing this kind of crisscross pattern, and the planes, basically one of the planes hits the other plane, knocks it off course. That's his plane. His X-15 goes down and he dies in a plane crash. That is Joe Walker, who was the X-15 pilot who told us about what's being used to chase UFOs. The question there is, did Joe Walker say too much? And is that like, Is he in the category that we have Marcel, who's going to just be disappeared there over the Bermuda Triangle? Seems a little bit odd. I mean, these guys were experienced pilots. Accidents do happen, but anything around the X-15 and UFOs raises some serious questions. The astronaut Gordon Cooper, for example, reported when he was a fighter pilot over Germany in the 1950s, he scrambled with the other Sabre jet fighter pilots to intercept a formation of UFOs flying over his base. He said when he was doing trainings that the Foo Fighters would show up in formation. So not only are they inspecting them, they're kind of imitating their movements in formation. And when his fighter group got too close, the formation of the UFOs flew away. Cooper also described film that he saw at Edwards Air Force Base in California in 57 of a UFO landing. He sent the film to Washington and then followed up with the Blue Book officers. They said, forget about it. Don't ever talk about it. Now, a couple of key interactions that take place with Corso around JFK are fascinating. And then we're going to move into our final run, and then we'll take your questions. How's that sound? Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. It's X Series 201, the UFO File Deep Event. Incoming Free Eye Atlas. The Avi Lobe Mellon gang. They're back for another run, and it's the run this time is for the fall UFO event. Okay. This is more Corso. There were people floating around Washington right at that very moment, 1961, who, even out of the most well-meaning intentions they could muster, would have shipped the Roswell file over to Russia while patting President Kennedy on the back and congratulating him for contributing to world peace. Trudeau said, "These were the same people who lost Korea for us and who you had to fight over at the White House. You know exactly who I mean. We got to keep whatever's valuable here from falling into the wrong hands because as sure as we're standing in this Pentagon, it'll find its way right to the Kremlin." This gets into a really deep conversation, which is dropped so badly in both the JFK community and the UFO file community, which is the key to so many of the problems that Kennedy is having, is that he wants to share the UFO file with the Russians to reduce tensions in the Cold War. And it's the same thing as doing, the missile treaty and the nuclear test ban treaty, which is incredibly huge. To do a test ban treaty in that era where everybody's aiming weapons at each other, the fact that Kennedy got that is a miracle. That Kennedy isn't credited, they're finally starting to give him some credit for the Cuban Missile Crisis, where he saved the world, thank you. But the nuclear test ban treaty was absolutely important, and he negotiated it and got Khrushchev to sign, where they stopped doing nuclear tests in the atmosphere. Incredible. But he also is trying to use all of his leverage to reduce this, because he saw during the Cuban Missile Crisis, hey, this could get outside of our hands very, very quickly. And even if you wanted to prevent a war, you couldn't, because, so many orders had gone out that couldn't be rescinded. So it has to be understood that there is factual evidence available that Kennedy was trying to do a joint moon mission. He announced it in a UN speech before his death. Sergei Khrushchev, Khrushchev's son, said they were going to do a joint space program. Well, that gets rid of the space race, gets rid of Cold War tensions in general, doesn't it? You're not going to have Vietnam and all the rest of it. So there's a lot of problems, I think, with how people look at the two events of the JFK assassination and the piece about Kennedy wanting to share the UFO file has to be crucial in the JFK assassination research. It can't be missed because it's a hidden factor that is so important to those people on the inside, because they've kept that secret. They practically invented the CIA to keep that secret. Let's go a little further. There were people who would have cut General Trudeau's and my throat and left us on the rug to bleed to death while they packed the Roswell file away. There's also those types. That's the X-Protect branch he's describing. oh my God, he's saying, look, X-share people, they'll go too far and the Russians will get their hands on this. And the X-protect people will kill us even for talking about it. So they're describing those two elements, those two factions that we pinpoint on this show, which are crucial to all our geopolitical considerations. And believe me, that's incredibly active here in 2025. Either way, Trudeau didn't have to quote me chapter and verse to explain that he was handing me one of the most important assignments I would ever receive from him. He was giving me the keys to a whole new kingdom. But neither he nor I knew what in the world we could do with this. And what happens is, according to Corso, he runs it through industry and he gets a scientific group, including Robert Sarbarker, which makes sense because Sarbarker said he was called in to try to work with redeveloping material that had come from crashed saucers. Look, Sarbarker said, I don't know why, this is the 1980s, and he died shortly after giving this information. He said, I don't know why they're still keeping it after all this time. Vannevar Bush headed up the UFO file. He handed it off to Arthur Compton. These guys, they worked with the best, von Braun and all the rest of it. And they studied what we had. And he said, what they found with the figures that were inside, he didn't even say they were beings. He said that somebody had constructed insect-like humanoids to run the stuff. And he said the only thing that we could make out about them is they seem to have, insect-like qualities. And he figured that they were built to absorb the incredible, G-force and other things from the incredible maneuvers of the craft. But here is our friend Corso saying that Sarbarker is being tapped for this activity. And he also brings up Hermann Oberth from the German space program, along with our friend von Braun. Okay, a few more quotes from our friend Corso, and then we'll jump in.
Okay.
How are you doing? You got something?
I'm just trying to organize. There are so many questions coming in from different angles that I have to, group them all together for order.
Yes. It's interesting because one of the things that Corso said he was doing was he was giving updates on the X-15 activities to Robert Kennedy. And he makes an interesting point where he says, I wasn't telling him they were extraterrestrial. I was just telling him basically the results of what was going on there. There's some weird understanding between him and Robert Kennedy. But in his own biography here, he says that he briefed Robert and John, which I find very interesting. Now, and that is a shot, by the way, of the actual X-15 in the hangar now. And this incredible Walter Dornberger project of the X technology that could fly at these incredible speeds that they were utilizing to do what? To chase UFO. This is Joe Walker, who died piloting the X-15 after identifying in public that he had seen these UFOs and that the X-15s were used to chase them. That's what Walker said. So I think that Walker said too much, and I think that's what perpetrated the accident upon him. Okay, a couple of interesting things from our friend. I'm going to read a couple more quotes from Corso here. Let's see if I can do it. I was not in Roswell in 1947, nor had I heard any details about the crash at that time because it was kept so tightly under wraps. Even within the military, you can easily understand why, though, if you remember, as I do. The Mercury Theater wore the world's radio broadcast in 1938 when the entire country was panicked by how invaders from Mars had landed in Grover's Mill, New Jersey. There's our New Jersey connection. The cache of debris, the Roswell files, were the most closely guarded secret. And the information and Army retrieval team from the 509th Army Airfield plotted the wreckage of a flying disc that had crashed outside the town of Roswell in the New Mexico desert in the early morning darkness during the first week of July 1947. Roswell file was the legacy of what happened in the hours and days after the crash, when the official government cover-up was put into place as the military tried to figure out what it was that had crashed, where it had come from, and what its inhabitants' intentions were. A covert group was assembled under the leadership of the Director of Intelligence, Admiral Roscoe Hillenkoetter, to investigate the nature of the flying disc and collect all information about encounters with these phenomena, while at the same time publicly and officially discounting the existence of all UFOs. Corso gets handed the UFO file material from Roswell in 1961. There's a 14-year lag. So these other groups have had their hands on it, redeveloping that material, redeveloping the Aztec crash, and some of these others. So let's keep that in mind as we roll here. Another quote, and then on to your questions.
Okay.
How's that? I know I'm running late now. Woo. Okay. In 1961, regardless of the differences in the Roswell story from the many different sources who had described it, the top secret file of Roswell information came into my possession when I took over the Foreign Technology Desk at R&D. Now, I want to say this. The Foreign Technology Office was a stopping point for moving black projects through the government. So it was a way to help them go black. And because there was a whole thing around espionage with foreign intelligence, it was easy to change the story about what was going on there. So when he's pointing this out, and he's one of the first people who did talk about where the UFO, the various UFO parts would go for research, this is a very good explanation, as is the Atomic Energy Commission. My boss, General Trudeau, asked me to use the Army's ongoing weapons development and research program as a way to filter the Roswell technology into the mainstream of industrial development through the military defense contracting program. Today, items such as lasers, integrated circuits, fiber optic networks, accelerated particle beam devices, and even the Kevlar material in bulletproof vests are all commonplace. Yet the seeds for the development of all of them were found in the crash of the alien craft at Roswell and turned up in my files some 14 years later. But that's not even the whole story. In those confusing hours after the discovery of the crashed Roswell alien craft, the Army determined that in the absence of any other information, it had to be an extraterrestrial. Worse, the fact that this craft and other flying saucers had been surveilling our defensive installations seemed to evidence a technology we'd seen evidenced by the Nazis, causing the military people to assume the flying saucers had hostile intentions and might have even interfered in human events during the war. So there's so much packed into that. And if you just take it as the actual account from Corso, just take his story straight there, it makes a great deal of difference. There were, the development of the laser, these other things were happening, and yet it seems like this supercharged everything in terms of the speed, and that is the development of the UFO file seems to have revolutionized our own industry, whether it came to, computer weapons and the entire digital aspect and the rollout of all these various technologies to the birth of AI, which I found at its very cradle, Bobby Inman shepherding a company with Marvin Minsky after his exposure to the UFO file. So you can see there's a strong possibility here that when we're hearing from Robert Malone that RFK Jr. got this briefing that Roswell was real and that we had gotten all these technologies from it, the entire question about Roswell and the advanced technology and its redevelopment is going to come back into the fore again, place where there was an attempt to try to figure this out. At a certain point, there seemed to be information coming together, and then, so now we're at a point maybe where this conversation is being opened up. Something is driving that conversation. We're going to get into that next. Miss Olivia, I'm going to throw it to you.
Oh my God, I don't even know where to start. Okay, Let's just make it broad at first. Okay, so Frank wants to know, why are they so secretive about the alien presence? And DA says, are you still thinking about doing the petition slash FOIA for the UFO files?
Well, a lot of people do FOIAs for them, and I think we get interesting information and material from that, but it's not the route that I've chosen. But what I do have is for the committee that's going on there, since the committee is active only for a short time longer, say till October 1st, I believe, and that is the D-Class Committee, the task force run by Luna and Burchett. They have the ability to bring together the Kennedy case and the UFO file in a way that could really shake things up. Unfortunately, what I'm hearing is they're doing very predictable things in the background, but they are ticked off that they've been played by the whistleblowers. So maybe there's some opening there that can happen. Yes, Miss Olivia.
David Donaway, in 2024, Avi Lobe delivered a speech in which he declared his view that the Messiah will be an alien who arrives from outer space.
This is the thing that I pulled. I found that quote and I put it up on X, and I read it when I did the Alex show. It was in New York Magazine, and the quote says, I don't believe, like many Orthodox Jews do, that the Messiah will, show up here. I think it'll be an ET Messiah, and it's going to tell us, stop your warring down here because there's so much real estate in the galaxy. But the ET Messiah theme, this is something, it comes up here and there. I think there's a pinch of it in Greer's work for sure. There's the whole benevolent alien angel thing. And so, I think you're kind of working different sides of this. But what I do feel is, in particular with Loeb, that they want to try out the AI overlord thing, communicating with the Earth. And he's the Harvard scientist who had an interest in UFOs. I mean, it's kind of like they're writing the Contact script or something. And they're running a totally different op with him than they are with Elizondo. But remember, over here at Harvard's astrophysicist lab, they are working together at Galileo, and Elizondo and Mellon are right at the top of that Galileo organization with Loeb. So it's all the same. Yeah.
Well, it's also a way to bring in the technocracy. So,
yes.
Because, the aliens are here and they want to deal with technocrats. They want to deal with the smartest, the best, and the brightest, right?
Right. Well, Loeb's a genius who was working on science starting at 14. And as I said, he was brought over here to be part of the Star Wars defense grid and to build the SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative for the Reagan administration, which was ostensibly set up to block ICBMs, but was actually, and that's revealed in Corso's book as well, Star Wars was part of a UFO defense grid. And it's very interesting because in Corso's language, in his book, he says the development of SDI saved us from being subordinate to, these UFOs which chased us off the moon and this other stuff. It seems to me that's kind of the, glib comment from a military guy. And yet, there are things that have come out to support some of that, which is, for example, Gorbachev's coming out, at the New York Press Club and saying, with George Shultz sitting right there and Kissinger in the audience, the late Henry Kissinger, that Reagan took him aside and said, will you help us fight the UFO threat? Reagan was convinced there was a threat not because UFOs were shooting on our planes or anything like that, but because they were showing him video of these large craft around Saturn and some of them hovering around the Earth. Things. The stuff that he was looking at was in space, and he had a deep background on the UFO file going back to California, Gene Dixon, and this whole thing. So, he had the understanding about this, and of course, his famous speech after they played ET at the White House
Aha.
Steven Spielberg is there, and he says, everyone in this room knows that that is not fiction. That is reality. Yes. You're up.
Somebody made a comment about that. I was looking for it.
Oh,
About Reagan.
yeah,
So
yeah,
I'm having
yeah.
a hard time finding it, though.
That's okay. I'll show everyone a picture of Eugene Boone in the meantime. This is the guy at the crossroads of the two major historical events in history. Eugene Boone, on one hand, found the Oswald rifle in the Texas School Book Depository. One. He was an advertising executive before that, 20 years old. Guess who he was friends with? Jack Ruby. Interesting. At 22, he is deputy sheriff. He's a deputy. He goes in, he finds the rifle. And then guess what? A couple years later, he quits. He doesn't want to do that work anymore. And he takes over the foster business, and he becomes the CEO of their Christian children's homes. So he's, whatever else we want to say about Boone, he's being moved around through history. And he may not even be aware of what they're using him for, but to be at the crux at those two major events, I think is astonishing. One of the things I did in the first Roswell Reignited story is tell the story about Sergeant Major Robert Vinson. And Vinson was somebody who worked at NORAD. And Vinson's a very, very interesting, important character who, has very minor mention. He's not very well celebrated on the UFO side, not very well celebrated on the deep state JFK assassination side. He sort of hangs out there. And what he saw was, when they told him after he met some officials in DC to take this particular plane to go back to NORAD. And he said it was a weird plane. It didn't have the regular insignia. And later, we found out it was a part of the Janet Airlines. And they flew him, and midway through his flight, the pilot comes on. It's just him on the plane, and the pilot doesn't speak to him. But the pilot speaks in the intercom and says, President Kennedy has just been assassinated. We are rerouting the plane. And they turn the plane heading to Colorado, and it lands outside Dallas by the Trinity River. And according to him, it lands almost kind of rough on this rough patch. And then these guys in construction clothes get on, and one of them is Oswald, and the other one is a tall Cuban-looking guy. And they walk right past him. They don't say anything. They go up into the cockpit. And then he doesn't know what's going on. Plane takes off. And a little while later, it lands. The pilot, the Oswald double, and the Cuban walk by him. They don't say anything. They rush off the plane. And he's like, what am I doing here? Where am I? He gets off the plane and he goes over the little office where there's a light on and an MP in there. He says, where am I? And the guy says, you're at Roswell Air Force Base. And you're not going to be able to fly out anywhere. The president has been assassinated. But here is Vinson on the record, NORAD officer, saying he saw the Oswald double taken from the Trinity River and flown to Roswell. So Roswell occupies this very unusual corridor. And just to, take it to the next ultimate strange level in the case, there's another very interesting, compelling connection here, which is General Walker. Well, General Walker, he's the one that they accused after Oswald was dead. They accused Oswald of having shot at him and missed. And they invented this whole story, whole cloth, about Oswald shooting this right-wing general. Well, Walker, very interestingly, I found out in my research, had spent 4 years in Roswell, New Mexico, at their military academy. There's another very kind of powerful 4-year overhang, and Edward, Walker, General Walker, being in the middle of that, he shows up a couple of times during the Kennedy presidency. In fact, Bobby Kennedy has him thrown in prison for insubordination. They let him out 30 days later, but they're fearing that he's going to cause some kind of revolutionary activities. because he's like into the John Birch Society in that period. And, he thinks the communists are taking over and all the rest. Quite interesting that he runs for governor in Texas. And of course, while running for governor, it's John Connally that wins. But Walker is an unusual figure. And then the piece that likes to get massaged in there in the official historical record is very easy to understand that Oswald's guilty because he took a shot at this general here just to become famous. There's no evidence at all, zero, of Oswald being involved in an attempted shooting at Walker. And Walker himself said he didn't believe it because they were trying to say that the bullet that they pulled out of his wall that went through his window when he was sitting in his chair at night matched the Arcano, which again, very strange. Is that even Oswald's rifle? And he said, no, I knew when they took the ammo out of the wall that it wasn't the type of ammo that would work in a Carcano rifle. And he's a general. I mean, he's going to know. So that whole thing was bunk, but it was like, we need that extra insurance. What if people don't buy that Oswald could do all this stuff? We need to give him a background of being an assassin. And so all of the CIA authors and stuff would be like, if you look at it, the Rosetta Stone of the Kennedy assassination is the Walker shooting.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the Walker shooting wasn't on the record it hadn't. I mean, Kennedy is assassinated. They didn't have anybody for that shooting, and they just kind of implanted Oswald on top of that. So it's not any kind of Rosetta Stone for anything. And that's the type of people that you got. The reason that I can spot the intel infiltrators in the UFO files so well is because when you study the Kennedy assassination, you learn everything. And what you can learn very easily is intelligence manipulation to keep a narrative in place. And they'll roll out the authors, they'll give them, the green light, they'll give them all the interviews, they'll give them the Netflix series, whatever it happens to be. And they've been doing that. If you study the Kennedy assassination and you just move that over to the UFO file, it's very easy to see Mellon and Elizondo and Nolan. You understand the CIA and how it works. It's very, very simple, in fact. And what's amazing to me are the diehards who come to me even after Elizondo has been outed so many times as, hardcore intelligence officer working at black sites and things like that, and spewing this nonsense for the government. And they'll be like, but Lou said that the UFO file, that they were trying to get it out, and they still don't understand that Lou was showing up for a job, and that the whole story about Lou Elizondo being a whistleblower was a joke. The New York Times ran that story, but when I researched it, and I could have used more heavy duty investigatory methods with just basic investigation of Lou Elizondo. I found out that he was working for 5 different government agencies. So any of those people
simultaneously?
Yeah, he's working
Wow.
for 5. He contracted with all of them. Space Force, he does it all. And so the idea that he left the government because he was upset, at what they were doing with UFOs doesn't add up at all. So it's a phony resignation. It's all to create this thing. That's why, OSEP, ATIP, you're going to fight about that nonsense. It's all BS. It's a BS story. Of course he was involved around covering up UFOs, and they needed to send somebody out along that line to do this. So Elizondo, he's a really good example of how the Central Intelligence Agency works, because they threw all this money behind him. They gave him TV show. They put his books out. They did all this thing. But he was carrying a counterintel. He was carrying water for the UFO threat narrative. And when it didn't work, so effectively, and questions got raised and lies got exposed, different things fell apart with Elizondo. The final thing was they had him hold up a phony picture so that they probably created a false momentum to cancel all the UFO hearings, because they were supposed to happen all summer, by the way. That whole task force was supposed to do all that. That all got nixed, supposedly right after Elizondo held up the phony picture.
Do we know
I
it's intentional?
I
do you
think Mellon said, hold up this phony picture. Look, Intel guys know 5 steps ahead. They're not going to hold up something false. They know anybody in the audience is going to figure it out. So he did it, and they nixed him temporarily to float that stuff down, and now they'll bring him back in some other capacity. I heard actually that he now is like a drone spokesman for drones that can get Mexican cartels, or So yeah, they'll do a lot of things with Elizondo, and but they needed to take him off, and they needed to raise up this Loeb thing. That's what they did. So that is not, yeah, it exposes Lou as a liar for holding up a fake picture, but it's designed. It's definitely designed. Yes.
That's really interesting. I'm just going to throw this out there. So I have a friend who does contracting for military and supplies, and they have meetings kind of, at least once a year for the kind of things they need to produce. And the word was, and this was early spring, I think, that we're going to have military operations in Latin and maybe even South America.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And that hasn't happened yet.
Yeah.
But it's just wondering,
A contingency plan.
yeah,
Yeah.
temporary stay on that.
Interesting. Yes.
Okay. Anyway, David Termina says it was George de Mohrenschildt's testimony that hinted Oswald took a shot at Walker.
Oh, isn't that interesting? Well, de Mohrenschildt was an oil geologist millionaire, and why he was hanging around with Oswald, I mean, it came out at the end of his life, and I believe he was trying to get something real on the record about Oswald, and he felt bad that they had blamed him as a patsy and killed him. And he said, Oswald was a fine person, one of the finest person I ever met. Well, you're not going to say that about an assassin, right? But interestingly enough, of course, he was very close to George Bush, deep in the oil business in Texas, in CIA business as well, and political business. And during this frenzied period when he tries to put out a book about Lee Harvey Oswald, and he writes a letter to Bush, who is now CIA director. And because of the way the letter comes in, Bush has to acknowledge the letter. I don't know how de Mohrenschildt did that. But so the letter is on record now. We see it. And he says, my old friend, I tried to write, and apparently it was stupid to write about Oswald. And now I find myself surrounded under this siege. Please remove this siege from me. These people are after me. And there's an incredible thing that takes place there where he flees the country, and he goes and he meets with Corso, the clairvoyant. It was a really kind of big deal in 1977. And he's trying to find a way, he meets this Dutch journalist who hooks him up with Corso. And Corso is like an energy healer and a psychic. And I don't know, de Mohrenschildt is desperate to do anything. And they're trying to put de Mohrenschildt, who is this, cultured man, this amazing figure and all that. And they're trying to, his wife was trying to put him in shock treatment, but he knew. He was like, oh my God, And also the House Assassination Committee is gathering together, and they're going to subpoena him. So Corso sits down with him, and according to the Dutch journalist, says, oh my God, like, you're associated with people who knew about the Kennedy assassination. And so, de Mohrenschildt flees the Netherlands, goes back to New York, goes to Florida. He's in his Florida home, and they stop by with a subpoena and give it to him. It's Gaetan Fonzi from the House Assassinations Committee. It's quite wild because Bill O'Reilly, who was doing Kennedy investigations in the late 70s, believe it or not, he claims he was there the day he was going to interview de Mohrenschildt, the day that he got killed. But I looked into that actually, and his dates weren't right. So I don't know if he he inserted himself in the story. But it is interesting nonetheless. And of course, Oswald, there's a CIA person named Walter Moore who instructed de Mohrenschildt and said, there's this guy coming in from Russia. You need to shepherd him around the white Russian community. introduce them to people and stuff like that, get them a job. And so the whole thing about the Texas School Book Depository comes through that milieu. So they're able to stick him in to that position. And 6 weeks before the president goes by there, and of course, nobody knows that's going to happen. So it's one of the greatest telltales of the entire thing. Yes, Miss Olivia.
David Tremina again. Interesting that de Mohrenschildt's wife, a white Russian immigrant whose brother was doing, quote, secret work for the U.S., he worked for Howard Hughes, Lytton, TRW, and North American Aviation.
Oh, Lytton Industries, who I feel are involved in developing alien tech, as it were, and are in our documentary, X Protect the UFO File Assassins. Lytton is very important. It's also interesting to note that one of the biggest UFO cases that took place on their premises. And that is the 1973 case in Pascagoula, Mississippi. Incredible. Charles Hickson and the late, our friend there, Charles Hickson and his partner,
Calvin
Parker,
Mm-hmm.
the late Calvin Parker, amazing guy, who met with Marcel, by the way, and claimed Marcel kept a piece of the Roswell wreckage with him. I guess kind of
Who
insurance
arranged that
policy.
meeting?
He learned, actually, I think it was the woman who wrote this book, Linda Corley. I believe that that's correct because she knew, I think she lived close by to our friend, and they didn't know that they lived so close by, and he wanted to go and meet with them.
Damn, that's interesting.
Yeah. And then he was going to show him. He said, I have some of that memory metal. And we all know Calvin Parker, after his abduction experience, had an incredible nervous breakdown that wiped him out for 5 years. Look, the whole alien abduction thing, if you look at some people, they seem to thrive after the thing happened. This is a weird Hoffium effect as well. Other people, it's absolutely devastating. Look at Barney Hill. Barney Hill never goes back to work. He's unemployed after the abduction unravels him, and he will die 5 years later of a heart attack at the age of 46. But Betty Hill, the experience seems to almost invigorate her, and she's gung-ho about the group that visited her, and they don't quite look like Greys, do they? So it's very, very interesting. Yes.
Yeah, it's sort of like psychedelics.
Yes.
Some
Everyone
people, it kind of blows out your energy field, and
Good
you can
point.
have PTSD, or it's incredibly enlivening, and it awakens psychic ability.
Oh boy, is that true. It plays with your chakra centers, right? Oh, very interesting. I had a note here about the Nebra stone, but I didn't put a visual together for that. But I will say this, I want to throw this in about the Nebra stone as I've learned more about it over time. The Nebra stone is this fantastic ancient artifact which shows a remarkable setup and knowledge of astronomy, but it's got the Pleiades and the moon position and all the rest of it. But the people who had the Nebra stone are an unknown group in early Germany, somewhere dated to around 3000 BC. And that stone was discovered and then moved to the black market and things. And then the person who discovered it was sued and then spent 6 months in prison. All these crazy things happened with the Nebra stone. But I had an idea about the Nebra stone, and we'll pursue it in another episode, probably with Gigi Young, about that being a kind of predictive stone of an astrological alignment that comes around for humanity at certain periods, because they found religious artifacts with it when they went back to the site. So I wanted to mention that that's coming in there as a kind of like a little unconscious Easter egg. Yes.
Since you just brought up Gigi, I wanted to read a couple comments about
Yes.
last week's show.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Juliet of the Spirit said, I thought Gigi was spectacular on
Yes.
last week's show. William Macedo said, last week's show was incredible. Gigi brings a lot to the table. And Jessica Rodriguez said, Gigi Young brings the spiritual, mystical side to the conversation. She is a wonderful, beautiful person. So much love when she gets together with DJ. The shows are always the best.
Oh, look, this is the interesting thing about this period because you have, there's all this stuff out there in pop click land. There's all these podcasts and things like that. And you just hope for quality. And in the middle of this, you have incredible, incredible people operating. And if you want to get around the mystical stuff, it's very hard to find somebody who understands the mystery schools, who understands a genuine psychic experience, things of this nature. And there's Gigi Young in the middle of this whole wave of stuff. And we've worked with her. She's been, close ally and a great friend for the show. And her work is so very important. I think we're just starting to see how crucial the stuff that she's bringing forward is. So yeah, Gigi, absolutely agree 100%.
I don't even, I just sort of space out when I listen to Gigi.
Yeah,
I
right.
can't stay with her intellectually. I just start to just drift into like a higher, and I just trust that my subconscious is taking in what it needs to.
Oh yeah, I had
But-
that.
Mhm.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, it's wonderful to, it's kind of a cheat, right? I listen to her and then I feel like I've been meditating for 6 months and I haven't been. So it's just, it's being with her. I get a transmission.
Yeah, there's no question about it. I remember the Transcenders were this group that I interacted with, and the guy was from Canada, Rick Thurston, and he would channel, he would go into trance the way that Casey went into trance, and he said remarkable things. But just in the dealing with him, your whole, your feelings would change. That's the ability for some of these incredible energy people. I wanted to fill in a couple of blanks for a few things I mentioned real briefly. So I mentioned the X-15 in relation to the pilot that had died and how Corso said the X-15 was used to, quote, chase UFOs. But it was developed by Dornberger and was a leftover from an advanced German Nazi project. It's been my feeling that the Germans were ahead of the curve on the, UFO side, not only their own development, but in terms of recovery, observation. And we know that they had like the Brill group were set up to interact with ETs on some kind of a spiritual level, right? They're mediums and things. And, but I think that they were very ahead on this track. And that's where it's interesting to me because there's a competition that seems to brew in the minds of the Americans versus the Germans about who can redevelop that UFO information fast. That fight moved to the Russians and the Americans. It seems to me as part of a Cold War piece as well. And I still see it playing out in terms of the advanced technology in this period. So when you're dealing with Trump and Ukraine and Russia and Putin, there's an undertow of not giving away our secrets about the advanced technology we've gleaned from redeveloping the UFO file. But Dornberger was, in fact, the CEO of Bell Aerospace. And Michael Payne, was his protege. But he was also von Braun's boss in Nazi Germany, the space program. And it was, in fact, von Braun who saved him from judgment at Nuremberg because he used slave labor to build the V-2 rockets. Now, Payne, there's no explanation for a lot of things with Payne. Payne would go on to say, oh, yeah, I remember the picture of Oswald with the gun and the rifle. But then he also said, oh, I told Lee you couldn't have any weapons in the house. But so Oswald's going to show him pictures of him with a rifle and keep a rifle in the garage. Doesn't make any sense. So Payne never made any sense. But he is the stepson of Arthur Young, who developed the helicopter. And he was also very, very deep in consciousness studies. Arthur Young founded the cosmic meditation, and there's a whole institute for consciousness based on Arthur Young. So there's a very rich piece back there. And what Payne said, was, oh, yeah, Oswald had all these political thoughts and he said all this negative stuff about General Walker. So he was able to put this thing out about Walker. But again, I want you to see the pattern in history of falsehoods because General Walker was diametrically opposed to JFK. So if you are going to assassinate General Walker, it makes no sense that you're going to assassinate JFK also. So, the choose your poison here, deep state. How are you going to portray the designated culprit here? But what they tried to do with Payne was do that. And of course, Payne's wife, Ruth Payne, was the one who was like, oh, hey, look, I found a letter to the Soviet embassy. And look, I found this other thing, Oswald holding a rifle, everything, all the evidence that convicted Oswald in the public eye came out of the Payne household. That's important to keep in mind because with Payne, we have the Dornberger connection. And Dornberger, part of that paperclip piece, the advanced technology piece, embedded in NASA, embedded in the space program. And Kennedy turns to that group and says, prepare, we're going to share the UFO file with Russia. This is the big key missing in the entire story. That's the aerospace involvement. Yes, what do you
Okay,
got?
Najat Madri, don't you think RFK Jr. already knows everything about Roswell? He doesn't need any government agency to inform him. So the real question is, what signal is the government giving him about Roswell?
I don't know about RFK. See, I think there's a family legacy of passing down things as well. I'm not sure that he got all of the benefit of that incredible intel of his uncle and dad. So that is, that's a very interesting process of how that stuff is kept, etc. But I would say that he's the type of person who's very curious and with Tulsi and other people around could be like, can you get me a briefing on this whole UFO subject? Now, there were pictures of him with some UFO figures or people who had been close to Greer around some event that he was at. And, so there are people who are involved around the UFO thing who are kind of have had communication with Bobby. When I talked with him, we spoke when we got to Thane Eugene Caesar. It's very interesting because when we did our interview, which is the band interview, but it is on Rumble, we talked all about healthcare and all this other stuff, and people assumed, well, the pharmaceutical part is what got the episode banned. But actually, I included the final 10 minutes of our interview in the documentary. So the documentary is called The UFO File Assassins, X-Protect. So if you search for that in the Dark Journalist channel, you'll find it. But I think it's the section where he talks about Thane Eugene Caesar assassinating his father instead of Sirhan Sirhan that really got that episode banned. So yeah.
Transcendent Scholar, do you think a passing object, 3i Atlas, could cause a pole shift?
Well, it's interesting. Graham Hancock spent a great deal of time telling me about the impacts of comets in the past. We had him up here, and we did some live events with him. And he told me it's like setting off, 50 nuclear bombs. And, we're just past the anniversary of Hiroshima and some of the really terrible background of atomic bombs and their devastating impact. That's 80 years. And I noticed that a lot of the media was very silent about it, which is gives you a little bit of a chill in your spine. Like 80 years ago was Hiroshima, should be talked about because the dangers of nuclear exchange is what mankind and humanity has been engaged in preventing things like the Cold War and all the rest of it. Now we talk very loosely about tactical nukes and all this kind of stuff. So it's a great warning from the past. And we have technology that surpasses nuclear, dismantling nuclear technology and having these smaller countries, not developing new nuclear programs should be at the top of the agenda of any foreign policy track that the Trump administration is on. I'd like to hear more on that track from them. And there are ways to incentivize countries not to do that. Part of this is going to come down to revealing the more advanced energy sources that we've developed. And no one wants to do that because no one at that level, the corporate hierarchy wants to do it because they haven't figured out how to reveal those things and stay in charge. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. It's X Series 201. Going deep, deep tonight. The UFO file, deep event incoming. 3i Atlas. Philip Corso, Roswell reignited, and really putting these things on a deep level and a very potent thing. We're going to take a few more of your questions and then we'll wrap it up.
Joseph says the Chelyabinsk meteor incident.
Wow. I mean, this is incredible. And, the idea, look, if somebody like Loeb were just saying, we need to keep an eye on this space junk and the comets that are coming in and all the rest of it. Rudolf Steiner, of course, had great things to say about the importance when a comet enters the system, reflecting on it from a mystical point of view. So we know there's something very powerful about it. Problem is, these are the people associated with the UFO threat, and they're using those tactics to get it. And what's interesting is what I didn't read from Mellon, and we had enough Mellon for one night, but Mellon in his diatribe was talking about how, this could be AI from another system coming into our system. And that's what the UFO thing could be all about. And, we need to figure it out and we have to get on board with it. And you've had other guys in that program like Gary Nolan who said, oh, yeah, we've used the whole threat idea in order to get people's attention. Well, if that's true, then if you're using it to get people's attention, then that's, you're putting it on the record that you're just a liar. But it is interesting because Mellon was at one of those SALT conferences where they are looking for venture money for these various ventures. And of course, he's developed the UAP, disclosure fund, UAPDF, and all that kind of stuff. And here he is sitting on, the Mellon billions and all the rest. I don't know. That wouldn't be the place I would put my money for UFO disclosure. I think that's the last place you'd get it. But yeah, very interesting. Okay, what else you got?
Okay, Amanda, didn't Wernher von Braun say something about the asteroid op followed by the alien invasion op?
Yes. There'd be a space threat. And there's no question that we've had, this has been raised before. I don't know if somebody, though, Loeb is really putting it out there that he's used the term alien threat, which I think is absurd because you have zero proof of anything like that. Never mind trying to prove something like that. But obviously he's trying to fit his narrative. And he may even be trying to see, what the envelope is. Or a lot of what they do, look, intelligence work, on one hand, they're doing a couple of things at once. So on one hand, they are putting out a narrative like that. But on the other one, they're data mining. So like I said, just like they flushed Elizondo with the phony picture, they did a lot of data mining with him. What will work if a guy goes out there and says we're under attack and that he's going to defend you, and you pretend that he's a disgruntled guy and he wants that government to help us, but you have to forget that he is the government. So they got a lot of data back from that. They got a lot of data back from the Northcom exercise. They got a lot of data back from the drone non-explanation. So now they have that to work with. So they can get a lot from Loeb going out there as a the top Harvard guy at the astrophysics lab, all those great credentials and all the rest. If he's going out there and going out on a limb and saying, you know what, it's an AI alien genius threat thing, then, they're going to get a lot back from that, because people will be like, well, this guy, it's not like he's some crazy person. But what they don't realize is that these are narratives that are run. So once you get with that, you don't want to be cynical about everything. This is part of
do.
this is part of the side effect. You have to be able to read between them. But something like that coming from this group who have repeatedly lied. Remember, they're liars on record. So that's the thing that we've pointed out about that UFO disclosure group that's run by Mellon and the Central Intelligence Agency and that whole thing. And it's very easy to, they all work together and do movies together. Jim Semivan, Lou Elizondo, they're all CIA people. So that's what they're about with the UFO op. Yes.
Years ago, I came up with a saying, never trust anybody with an ego. So, and pretty much everyone here has an ego. And that's true, because if you have an ego, you have an agenda.
Oh, yeah.
So
yeah.
That's the point.
I like that.
Anyway, 5DRG says, my opinion, they will create a UFO threat. Then we will find out some humans have, quote, alien DNA. Therefore, they are enemies of the state.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. Did you get that from listening to the Dark Journalist show? I think we gamed this out like a couple of episodes ago, but the idea was, and I think it's interesting because there's something very fascinating that Dr. Farrell has said. And he said this a long time ago, because he was talking about how when they were setting up these very heavy duty TSA, X-ray machines and all the rest of it, that they were looking for something. They were looking for a certain physical characteristic in those X-rays. And that got into a whole conversation about hybrids and all the rest of it. Problem is, no, there's no problem with that theory, actually. I really like that. I just mean, in general, when I'm talking about separating these things out, there's facts, and there's supposition, and then there's imagination. And imagination is a wonderful thing when used. And when you do research, you lead with facts and let the imagination carry you along. But I think, just on the face of it, if you really think about it, then you would, if you felt like there was a being here that was had a different characteristic, for example, how would you locate them? Right? But the op part of it that you're suggesting in your question goes something like this, that they're making it up. And they're going to make up that certain people, another reason to hate somebody else, right? That's what they're good at. There's no question. I'll tell you this, which I find interesting, which is there's no question but that the intelligence agencies have run headlong into the UFO narrative this way. Before, they used to block it out, and they would leak certain things through movies and things like that. But now what they realized in 2016, the top search in Google was for UFOs. And they realized, we can't get around this. Let's co-opt it completely. Let's change our tune on it. Let's let the media talk about it, and we'll turn it. Now we're ready to turn it to our own purposes. And that gets very, very tricky. But we've seen that, where they're willing to strip the whole idea of gender concepts, where they're willing to strip the whole idea of free speech rights, where they're willing to strip, the whole idea of what it is to be a human, to the point where a Supreme Court justice can't say what a woman is, then those people are meddling with the very fabric of physical reality itself. So, in terms of what they want to do and how they would twist something like that, there's no question that they want to monkey with that whole story of humanity's origins. So that humanity origin story becomes a major prize in their arsenal. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show, X Series 201. By the way, if you're new here, go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter. That's how we stay in touch with each other. That's a free newsletter, and it lets you know about the incredible X Series shows we have coming up, interviews, the powerful Gigi Young interview we just did. We had Bosley on, Joseph Farrell. We have Farrell coming on, and I have these other fantastic interviews lined up. Want to be an incredible, and I mean incredible, end of summer into fall, and the X Series episodes, the mini series, of course, JFK and the UFO file, and some of the things we're doing with the incredible film team around Atlantis and the Pyramid X specials. All of that is there for you. Stand up and be counted. Go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for the newsletter. Okay, the last round of questions, and you're up.
Let's talk about the Golden Dome. So Jonathan Kiner
Oh, yeah.
says, what makes you think the Golden Dome is to fight off an alien invasion? Does that mean you think they're hostile towards humanity? Or does the government believe that they are? And Infinitum Neo says the Golden Dome is a space weapon.
Yeah, well, I think of it as space defense, the way that Star Wars was. And in fact, I listened very closely when Trump announced it, and he said this is what Reagan wanted to do, but he couldn't do it back then. Well, I think Reagan did it back then, but these guys can do it even better now. Yes. And he was putting it on the record. The whole idea of it being able to prevent the United States from being attacked from hypersonic missiles is something you could get behind. I do think, though, the problem is the nature of surveillance and things that aren't. This hasn't been cleared in society. We're still having tremendous problems with these different separate powers consolidating, and they're consolidating your medical data, your financial data, your free speech rights, things of this nature. So the idea of the Golden Dome would be great under the right type of leadership. But I think what's even more important, maybe when we look at it, is the idea of what it's used for. And this could be part of the Trump administration officials like Bobby, like Tulsi, like Vance, all talking about UFOs this week, because the Golden Dome is definitely involved with the idea of a UFO defense grid. Now, whether they'll admit to that or they need to just keep the public facade around this other thing is a different question. A lot of the things I see with Trump are very interesting because he knows that UFO file has been taken outside of the executive branch. So Trump doesn't talk a lot about the UFO file, but there are hints, I believe, in the people he selected, in his uncle's background, and some of the comments that he's made about Roswell to his son on his son's podcast, saying there are a lot of things about Roswell, and that weird look in his eye. He knows, and he's a deep player on the UFO file, but he keeps his cards close, and there's a major multipolar thing going on in the world right now. And the whole thing about the UFO file, from our perspective, the intelligence agencies and everything else, has always been unipolar. And the idea of everybody getting a hand of that UFO file is anathema to that group. And so when you think of it that way, it makes a lot more sense. The other thing is the Russians have an incredibly, and I mean incredibly well defined, developed UFO program of their own. So there's incredible brinkmanship going on that does not get talked about. And, maybe in this environment of pop click stuff, it couldn't get talked about intelligently, but on this show it can. And, in the work of the people we work with, you can get that conversation. So that's where the conversation gets going. And that committee, the Luna Committee, the Burchett Committee, which I bring up often, but it's because of what it's slated to do. It's not because of what it's been doing. It hasn't done any UFO hearings, but it has the ability to present that before the American people. And, they can link directly the assassinations involved in the Kennedys family to the UFO advanced technology aspect, as well as, that's how, see, it's like when you talk about one thing, I remember somebody wrote to me and said, I first heard you talk about UFO and JFK, and I thought it was pretty far out, but it's made more sense to me. If you can get your head wrapped around the idea that the Central Intelligence Agency is very involved in aerospace, very, very involved through groups like the NGA and the NRO and others. They have their people honeycombed throughout that, because when you're the CIA, you have to know all of that stuff. So if you understand that the Central Intelligence Agency was engaged in assassination in 1963, the 35th president, then you look for various reasons. There's been various reasons that have been rolled out. It's very interesting that aerospace has been left out, because aerospace is such a major push in the Kennedy administration, and he has so many headwinds going into that. But even the assassination scene itself, where he is heading to meet at the Trade Mart, the person he is going to meet is Lloyd Berkner, who is very involved in aerospace, and he headed up the Robertson UFO panel. So it's there. And when he's on that trip, he goes and he visits the aerospace medicine lab. And just previous to that, he visits von Braun, who's looking at the rocket program. So aerospace is not some thing over here separated. It is directly integrated. The whole idea, the original idea back in Nazi Germany, was you build this stuff in space and control things on the ground. And they just took this idea over time and realized the power of, what you can do from above with satellites and low Earth orbit satellites, and all those types of things. So you realize the amount of power and surveillance control. Then the whole aerospace part and the space part makes tremendous amount of sense. If you want to go deeper and say, the whole elite connection with Mars and all the rest of it, there's a number of factors that are involved there. But aerospace should be right at the beginning when you're looking at these forces and how they're manipulating things. Look at Musk. Look at Musk and how close he was in with the presidency. And how once he didn't get his NASA guy in there, suddenly he turns Trump into a criminal, right? And he even threatens to strand some people on a space station. Well, thank God he didn't do that. But you can see, understand there's an oligarchy in space. And in my opinion, a guy like Musk wants to be the space president, but a lot of them do. I think Bezos does as well. So these things are intricately connected. So when we're talking about something like the space program and the involvement of Kennedy in the UFO file and him wanting to share it with the Russians, and that being the cause of the final straw of them saying he has to go, you understand it makes a lot more sense when you piece that together. Also, the UFO thing was a big deal in his time, but they did not talk about it publicly. So how do we talk about it on any real responsible level? Well, thank God we've had some people who've come out of that milieu of working in the Kennedy era who talked about the fact that, yes, he was briefed on UFOs, he was working on the issue, he was doing all these things behind the scenes. So, it gives us our history back in that sense. And the people who didn't want to share that information were also working very deeply with the UFO file. In fact, Harold Malmgren was talking specifically about Curtis LeMay's role in UFO file policy when he was there as a, junior advisor himself. So this is a missing chapter in our history, yes, but we can fill in a lot of those blanks. Yes, Ms. Olivia, the final question of the evening.
Okay, David, it's not really a question, but David Termina says, DJ, how odd is it that Chris Mellon's brother Matthew met with Trump just a month before his death in 2018? He was not only dating RFK's daughter, but also obsessively talking up UFOs.
Oh, yes, and he's the one who passed away in that very strange Mexico rehab. Oh, it's an incredible story. I'm glad you brought that up too. And that's a sad story for Mellon's brother, but it is very interesting factors and the different things that these people are involved with. And his death, I think, was very strange, very highly suspicious. And I did promise you a picture. There's General Walker. 4 years in Roswell. I mean, that's interesting. But Walker is a big question mark in history. Oddly enough, I found that in the 1970s, he was coerced into a bathroom, and that he hit on this guy in the bathroom. And then it turned out the guy was an undercover agent, and the charges were dropped because they said it was entrapment. But they must have known about Walker, that he had this kink to him. And that's a very unusual piece there. And let's see what else I have.
Did he deny it?
No, I think it was a no contest type
Okay.
thing, but he didn't have to really do anything because it was, he was coerced, so they couldn't do anything with it. But you can imagine the people in the background who were collecting that kind of thing.
It's amazing how many power brokers
Yeah.
around the Kennedy assassination are all gay. And we've had this conversation
Oh, yes.
so much.
Yes.
I'm going, what on earth is that all? It's a very strange
Well,
club.
it opens up a lot of different possibilities. But Clay Shaw,
Mhm.
Edgar Hoover, Jack Ruby. I mean, it's remarkable. So there's a heavy duty repression
Ferry.
aspect going there. And Ferry, of course, such an overseer for Oswald. And Oswald's intelligence career is remarkable, because if you think about Oswald, he's a remarkable person in this sense, which is he lived in the Soviet Union when it was the most closed off from America, and there were very, very few Americans who got in there. He lived there, he worked there, and he married the niece of a Russian GRU colonel. So, and then brought her back. I mean, it's pretty extraordinary. Now, let's face it, there may be even more things that are going to come out, and they may come out through this show relating directly to the history of Lee Harvey Oswald. And we have very, very exciting things coming up for you, that I can tell. Yes, Miss Olivia. Final.
Do you want to mention the Lionsgate portal?
Go ahead.
Okay, so Scarlet Fire says August 8th is the most pivotal day of the Lionsgate portal because it falls in the middle of the dates. The Lionsgate opens annually between July 26th and August 12th, but August 8th is when Sirius rises in direct alignment with Earth, showering us with light codes of spiritual wisdom and manifestation energy. The sun's placement in Leo, the sign of courage and self-expression, further enhances personal power and clarity.
Oh, that's fantastic. Wow. Yeah. Well, very interesting, because the Lionsgate is when they did Hiroshima as well. So, you can use it for good or ill. There were two things I left out of this episode which are critical. So I'm going to try to kind of put them in here, and I promise to expand on them in a later edition. But this is relating to what I said earlier about COG, and then as Bobby Inman as Deep Throat. This one is a group called Critic, which Professor Scott had pointed out as being associated and part of the arm of that second system, the COG system. The National Security Act 1947, as amended, the Executive Order 12333, amended to EO 13526 and other applicable provisions of law. I wanted to put the name on our radars. It's called Critic, literally, like you would think it was spelled, capital CRITIC. And it says, IC elements shall identify and report critical information consistent with this directive, provided to the Director of National Security Agency. Critical information is information concerning possible threats to U.S. national security that are so significant that they require the immediate attention of the President and the National Security Council. Critical information includes the decisions, intentions, and actions of foreign governments, organizations, or individuals that would imminently or materially jeopardize vital U.S. policy, economic information systems, critical infrastructure, cyberspace, or military interests. And there's a great deal here about how they would help to COG to take control in the event of a massive emergency event. So the emergency powers thing. And one of the acts that they cite here, see if I can get this in the last minute. Okay. An attack or major act of sabotage against the U.S. or against its allied forces. Outbreak of war involving at least one country closely linked to vital U.S. interests. Oh, we're hearing all about Israel now. Hostile use of weapons of mass destruction, of course. And terrorist acts of malicious cyber activity, incidents that heighten tensions along international borders, et cetera, et cetera. And this kicks in a whole program. And the person who set up Critic, which is this kind of NSA add-on to continuity of government, is James Clapper. Friend Clapper, who was the person I identified as being a handler of Lou Elizondo, and all the Elizondo people said, "Oh, no way!" And then he puts the picture of himself with Clapper in the book. What more can I say? But I do think it's interesting, and I think critic needs to be added to our vocab on all that. And now, this is very interesting, and I found an interesting overlay with this, if you'll grant me this. With the Area 51, there was a group in Area 51 that sued the government, and because they were a secret institution, they needed, very, very special legal help to get it done, and they were exposed to certain types of chemical burns and things like that. And the person who took on the case initially, I believe, was Jonathan Turley, a young Jonathan Turley. But this case was very similar to it, and it was a group that was under the tutelage or the leadership of Admiral Bobby Inman around this time of when he's accused of being Deep Throat. Okay. In somewhat curious ways of Washington, a still pending case involving espionage and intrigue has come to light in the form of an employee grievance. It is an employment dispute, however, the national security officials believe could have far-reaching implications for the CIA and other agencies that go outside the civil service to hire employees for special operations. Secrecy surrounding the case, the grievance has generated a paper record, some of which is public. It offers a rare inside look at the methods used to establish and operate a spy network. The case being considered by the Merit Systems Protection Board, little-known government agencies responsible for reviewing the grievance of dismissed or demoted federal workers that are not normally a repository of intelligence secret. Employment records and other bureaucratic papers are its customary currency. That's why a bit of a stir was caused last year when a special lockable file cabinet was wheeled into the office of the board's chief administrator, law judge John McCarthy, and security checks were run on several of his assistants. Soon, thousands of pages of classified documents were delivered to the Navy. Contrary to the board practice, Judge McCarthy ordered his courtroom closed and guarded. The case was brought by more than a dozen agents of a secret naval intelligence organization called Task Force 157. Now, this is going to be a springboard to an entire episode we're going to do about this. But Task Force 157 under Bobby Inman were doing all of these secret activities. Many of the people involved didn't even know that they were acting in a spy capacity. And the presence of the Task Force Academy, no one even knew that it existed until it was revealed by Bob Woodward. Again, weird overlap with Inman and Woodward. And this Task Force 157, you will see, I believe, is a prototype for how you would also deal with the UFO file. And many of these groups like the NRO, operated for 30 years without any public oversight or knowledge because we didn't know they existed. It's my contention that there's a group right now handling the UFO file, operating completely outside of the bounds of legal activity, that we don't know the name of who the organization is, and we don't know who the members are. Here's the interesting thing. Nobody knew about the NRO, as I mentioned. Well, there's a number of groups. Task Force 157 is an excellent example of covert groups operating inside the government under the umbrella of secrecy that we know nothing about. We cannot afford, when it comes to the advancement around exotic technology and all of its geopolitical implications in this environment in 2025, to be out of the loop and find out 30 years from now about a secret group that's managing the UFO file. These are the things where we can cut through a lot of the red tape. There's already people who are operating on that UFO file, the whole UAP secrecy piece. They're already operating and the government is already funding it, and we won't find out for 30 years. So the question is, how are we going to get to the bottom of it? If we understand how it's been done before, as I'll bring forward about Task Force 157, that's going to be major because we're going to have a entirely different understanding of who these groups are, how they can be operational, and how we can look for them, and the interface that they could be using. So, and some of the groups that are around, like Anduril Technologies, for example, who developed so many of the drones, and we saw so many of the drone attacks during, or the drone appearing in the sky during November and December. Radiance Technologies is another one that I would identify as a possibility in this department of people who would interface with that higher level. And so that's a deep research dive that we're doing here on the Dark Journalist Show. And you can be sure it's going to really open up, shall we say, a good deal about what's going on and why these people at the highest levels of government are talking so casually about the UFO file. And with that, Miss Olivia, your super chatters are up.
Hey. Up. Okay. Your With Me is fun. Thomas Ball, Stephen, Jake, Brian Scott, Ray Story, Norman Lee Smith Music, Robert Scott, Les Scott, Thomas Ball, Quantum Paradox, Muon Video, Volcanelli, Empire of Light, Channeling the Heart, Barbara Joyce, Terry Doherty, Old Man Junkins, Descat Brock, Erica Swenson Elliott, Jonathan McIntosh, Thomas Gonder, W. Ross, Conrad, Donna Marie Farrell, Ricky Tiki Tavi Dallam, Tom F., number 6, Babar J. Provolone, and Karen Carpenter. Thank you so much for your generous super chats.
Wow, incredible. And we really appreciate your support. Of course, to all our subscribers, we couldn't do what we do without you. So thank you for having our back in this fight to bring forward a lot of this information. I'll do a couple of shout outs here before we leave you. Love this picture of JFK with McNamara, his Secretary of Defense, getting some of that very, very tricky news on the national security side. But I imagine this is also Kennedy's reaction on hearing that the CIA was trying to keep the most high threat cases, the UFO file, away from it. But this is a such a thoughtful, deep person who considered what it would mean for the world, every action that we took here as a country. And so that's where President Kennedy gives us that incredible template for the country, for the future, and his work and his efforts echo some 60 odd years later. Let's see what we got out here tonight. Oh, thank you very much, DA. Appreciate it. Bob Marley. There we go. Love the music. Oh, Mermaid Moxie. God bless and Godspeed to everyone. Wow, wow. Thank you for being out there, Karen Carpenter. Terrific to see you. Oh, it's a great looking dog. Thank you, DJ and Olivia. I have now much to wind through after tonight. Indeed, to Hina on. Oh, that's interesting. That's a new word. Hina-on. I like it. What do you think that's think? Maybe. Thank you, DJ and Olivia, Wings Girl. Thought-provoking as always. Absolutely. Miss Olivia, congratulations. Nicely done. Let's see. What else we got out here? Lois. Crowns the week. Yes, indeed. Najat, hey, it's great to see you out there. Good night, dear X fam. Indeed, the ideas room was exceptional tonight. Exceptional question. Good night, says Richard Fretz. Nice to see you. Wait, where's that one? I miss it. Oh, DJ is not an alien, allegedly. Don Neway, there he is. Corey Anderson, have a great weekend, everyone. Indeed, it's going to be a fantastic, fantastic weekend for all. I know Kate's out there. Great to see you. Darcy Edmonds. Who else? Donna Marie Farrell. I know Joseph is out there. Great to see you, sir. Bosley was rocking the house. Let's see. Who else you got? Jimmy Carruthers. Cove Channel. Transcendent Scholar. Ricky Ticky. I'm glad everyone is so cat positive. Yeah, indeed. Of course. The cats are the best. Fabulous show. I like that one. Susan Blackstone gets the winner of the evening there. Thank you, Susan. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Amazing to be here with you and so great to have so many of you here in the Ideas Room. We will see you all next week. Exciting X-Series episodes, interviews, documentaries, all coming up for you.
Can I throw something out there? Okay. So CAC shared that Lloyd Bridges and Angie Dickinson played aliens marooned on planet Earth somewhere in the Southwest. It was an ABC movie of the week in the 70s. I am so looking forward to watching that this weekend.
Look, Archie Bunker is an English British Martian was very, very interesting. And I have to say, I still am wrapping my head around Carol O'Connor approaching Jesse Marcel. It's we're in deep X territory there. Have a great evening, everyone. And we'll see you all next week. And never let it be forgot that once there was a Camelot and there could be again. Don't forget. And even though it says end broadcast, Miss Olivia?
Never really ends.
Oh, it never really ends, does it? Have a great night, everyone.
God bless.